The buckskin courthouse had never seen such a crowd. Autumn sunlight slanted through dusty windows, casting long shadows across worn floorboards that creaked beneath the weight of the entire town. The air hung thick with tobacco smoke and the sharp scent of nervous sweat. Abigail Porter stood before Judge Hammond, her slender fingers clutching the faded blue fabric of her best dress. The bruise on her cheekbone had faded to a sickly yellow, but the memory of the blow remained fresh. Her eyes, clear as creek water, never wavered from the judge's weathered face. Beside her stood Maxwell Reed, silent and steady as the mountains that ringed their desert town. His presence was not that of a knight in gleaming armor, but of a weathered oak that had withstood countless storms. "Your Honor!" Walter Porter's voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd like a poorly honed knife. "She is my wife. The children are mine. The law stands with me in this matter." Walter straightened his collar, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. He had dressed for the occasion in a coat too fine for a man of his means, borrowed perhaps, or purchased with whiskey money that should have fed his family. Abigail felt her throat tighten. 3 weeks. Just 3 weeks of peace, of safety, of waking without fear. And now this moment that would determine the rest of her life and the lives of her daughters. Judge Hammond's gavel struck the bench. The sound reverberated through the packed courthouse like a gunshot. "This court will come to order," the judge declared, his voice carrying the weight of decades passing judgment. "We are here to determine the rightful custody of Abigail Porter and her 3 daughters." The judge's eyes, sharp, despite his 70 years, moved between the 3 figures before him, the husband claiming his property, the wife seeking her freedom, and the man who had dared to challenge the natural order of things. "Mrs. Porter," the judge began, "perhaps you'd care to tell this court how you came to leave your husband's home 3 weeks ago." Abigail drew a deep breath, memories washing over her like the flash floods that sometimes tore through the dry creek beds around Buckskin. "It began," she said softly, "with the birth of my 3rd daughter. 3 weeks earlier." Pain tore through Abigail's body, radiating from her center to the tips of her fingers. The midwife had left hours ago, rushing off to another birth across town, leaving Abigail alone with her 2 frightened daughters and a newborn who seemed determined to enter the world despite her mother's fears. "Push, Mama," Eleanor whispered, her 6-year-old voice steady beyond her years. "Like with Josephine. Remember?" Abigail nodded, sweat pouring down her face. Eleanor shouldn't know how to coach her mother through childbirth. No child should. But Eleanor had grown old before her time, had learned to tend to wounds, and to hide at the sound of heavy boots on the porch steps. Josephine, just 3, sat wide-eyed in the corner of their small home, clutching a tattered doll made from flour sacks and straw. "Water," Abigail gasped between contractions. Eleanor scurried to the bucket, returning with a tin cup that trembled in her small hands. Outside Buckskin baked under the autumn sun. The town had sprung up around a minor silver strike 15 years earlier, but the silver had played out quickly, leaving behind a collection of weathered buildings and even more weathered souls. Those with means had moved on. Those without remained scratching out livings from the desert's reluctant bounty. Abigail had once dreamed of a different life. As the daughter of the town's blacksmith, she had been afforded small luxuries books from passing peddlers, education enough to read and write with confidence. Her father had valued learning, had encouraged her curiosity in a time and place where a woman's questions were often met with scorn. Then he had died, his lungs finally surrendering to the forge smoke they had battled for decades. And Walter Porter, with his easy smile and promises of care, had seemed a salvation. The final contraction ripped through her like desert lightning. Abigail bit down on the leather strap Eleanor had placed between her teeth and pushed with the last of her strength. The child slipped into the world with a cry that pierced the late afternoon quiet. "A girl," Eleanor announced, wrapping the infant in the cleanest cloth they had. "She's beautiful, Mama." Abigail cradled her newborn, tears mingling with sweat on her cheeks. Another daughter. Walter would be furious. He had made his disappointment clear after Josephine's birth, had worn his resentment like a second skin for 3 years. "Ruby," Abigail whispered, tracing the perfect curve of the baby's cheek. "We'll call her Ruby." As if summoned by his name in her thoughts, the front door slammed open. Walter Porter stood in the doorway, his broad frame silhouetted against the dying light. The sharp smell of cheap whiskey entered the room before he did. "Well?" he demanded, swaying slightly on his feet. "Is it a son this time?" Eleanor retreated to her sister's side, pulling Josephine beneath the table where they had learned to hide when their father returned in this state. Abigail instinctively tightened her hold on Ruby. "A daughter," she said, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "Healthy and strong." For a moment, Walter's face remained blank, as if he couldn't quite process her words. Then his features contorted into something barely recognizable as human. "3 girls," he spat. 3 useless mouths to feed. What good are daughters to me? Can they work the claim? Can they carry on the Porter name? He kicked at a chair, sending it crashing against the wall. Josephine whimpered beneath the table. "I needed a son," he roared, advancing toward the bed. "One simple thing, Abigail. One thing a wife is supposed to provide." His hand struck, before she could shield herself, the blow landing on her cheek with enough force to snap her head back. Ruby wailed in protest, her cries only fueling Walter's rage. "Shut that thing up," he growled, reaching for the bottle he'd left on the table. "She's just born, Walter. She's hungry. I need to—" The second blow caught her temple. Stars burst behind Abigail's eyes, but she curled protectively around Ruby, shielding the infant with her body. "Worthless," Walter muttered, drinking deeply. "All of you. Worthless burdens." He paced the small room like a caged animal, kicking at anything in his path. The girls remained silent beneath the table, having learned young that sound drew their father's attention. And attention meant pain. "Get up!" Walter suddenly ordered, grabbing Abigail's arm. "Get out! Take your mewling females and get out of my house." "Walter, please!" Abigail gasped, still dizzy from the blows. "The baby just came. I can't—" "Out!" he roared, yanking her from the bed. Her legs buckled beneath her, weak from childbirth, but his grip never loosened. "I'm tired of looking at your failure." He dragged her toward the door, Ruby clutched desperately to her chest. Eleanor and Josephine scrambled from their hiding place, following in terrified silence as their father pulled their mother into the yard. With a final shove, Walter sent Abigail sprawling into the dust. Ruby's wails grew frantic. The setting sun painted the scene in shades of blood and fire. "Don't come back until you've figured out how to give me a son," Walter slurred, swaying in the doorway. "Or don't come back at all." The door slammed shut. The lock clicked with dreadful finality. Abigail struggled to her knees, her body screaming in protest. Birth fluids still dampened her skirts. Her milk had begun to come in, soaking the front of her dress. And now dust coated everything, finding its way into Ruby's eyes and mouth. "Mama," Eleanor whispered, helping Josephine to stand. "What do we do now?" Abigail looked at her daughters, one newborn, one barely more than a toddler, one forced into responsibilities no child should bear, and felt something inside her crumble. Not her resolve, her fear. "We walk," she said, struggling to her feet. "We find somewhere safe for tonight." She took one step, then another, each movement a battle against her body's demand for rest. Eleanor supported Josephine with one arm and tried to steady her mother with the other. The few neighbors who witnessed the scene quickly averted their eyes and retreated into their homes. In Buckskin, a man's treatment of his family was his business alone. They had made it to the edge of town when the wagon appeared, its wheels creaking protest against the rutted dirt road. Abigail sank to her knees again, strength finally deserting her. Ruby's cries had weakened to whimpers, a more worrying sound than her earlier robust wails. The wagon slowed. Through a haze of pain and exhaustion, Abigail saw a man descend, his movements deliberate, unhurried. "Mrs. Porter," a deep voice marked by the East, despite years in the territory. "Are you injured?" Abigail looked up into the weathered face of Maxwell Reed. She knew him by sight and reputation, a widower who kept largely to himself, tending a small ranch on the town's outskirts, and occasionally providing medical care when the need was dire. Some whispered he had been a real doctor once back east before coming west. "Mr. Reed," she managed, shame washing over her at being found in such a state. "We're just resting a moment." His eyes, dark as the coffee he was rumored to import from New Orleans, took in the scene with clinical precision: the newborn, the exhausted mother, the terrified children, the bloodied cheek. His hand moved to the revolver at his hip, then fell away. Something passed across his face, not pity, but a bone-deep weariness. "Did you just give birth?" he asked. His voice softened. Abigail nodded, unable to form words through her humiliation. Reed's gaze shifted to the Porter house visible in the distance. His jaw tightened. "He put you out after childbirth." Again she nodded. For a long moment Maxwell Reed was still, as if weighing a decision whose consequences would ripple far beyond this moment. Then he straightened, squaring broad shoulders beneath his worn canvas coat. Without a word, he strode toward the Porter house, his steps measured and deliberate. Abigail watched in horror, certain she was about to witness violence that would only make her situation worse. "Mr. Reed, don't," she called, her voice breaking. "He's drunk. He has a gun." Reed didn't slow. Walter must have been watching through the window, for he emerged onto the porch before Reed reached the gate, shotgun in hand. "This isn't your business, Reed," Walter called, raising the weapon to his shoulder. "Move along." Reed stopped at the gate. The two men faced each other across the short distance, the silence stretching taut between them. When Reed finally spoke, his voice carried clearly in the evening air. "If birthing daughters is a crime in this place, then I'll take responsibility for raising them to be the pride of this territory." The words hung in the air, extraordinary in their simplicity and their defiance of everything Buckskin accepted as natural law. Walter's face contorted in confusion, then amusement. "You want them the whole worthless lot. I'm offering shelter to a woman who has just given birth, and 3 children who deserve better than a night on the ground," Reed replied evenly. "The rest is not for me to decide." Walter lowered the shotgun, slightly thrown off balance by this unexpected turn. "Take them, then," he said with a dismissive wave. "See how you like feeding 4 useless mouths. You'll be begging me to take them back inside a week." Reed turned without another word and walked back to Abigail and the children. He knelt beside them, his movements careful, non-threatening. "Mrs. Porter," he said quietly, "I have room at my ranch. Clean water. A proper bed for you and the children. It's your choice, but you shouldn't be out here tonight." Abigail searched his face for hidden motives, for the predatory gleam she had learned to recognize in men's eyes. She found only steady resolve and something deeper, not kindness exactly, but a kind of determined decency. "Why would you help us?" she whispered. "Because it needs doing," he answered simply. Then, seeing her hesitation, he added, "I'll sleep in the barn. The house will be yours for as long as you need it." Eleanor tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, please," she whispered. "Ruby's cold." Abigail looked down at her newborn, then at her older daughters, their small faces pinched with cold and fear. Whatever risks Reed's offer presented, they couldn't be worse than a night in the open with a newborn and no supplies. "Thank you, Mr. Reed," she said at last. "We accept your kindness." The ride to Reed's ranch passed in silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and Ruby's occasional whimpers. Abigail drifted in and out of consciousness, her body's demands finally overwhelming her determination to remain alert. Eleanor and Josephine pressed against her sides, their small bodies rigid with tension. Reed drove with his eyes fixed on the road ahead, giving the small family what privacy he could in the confines of the wagon bed. Buckskin fell away behind them, its few lamps winking out in the gathering darkness. The road wound through scrubby desert-growth cacti, casting long shadows in the moonlight. After about 20 minutes, Reed turned onto a narrower track, and soon a small ranch house came into view. Unlike many of the hasty constructions in Buckskin Reed's home, had been built with care. A proper wooden structure with a stone foundation, it stood beneath the spread of a large cottonwood tree, its windows glowing with welcoming lamplight. Behind the house stood a barn and corral, and beyond them, barely visible in the moonlight, stretched a fenced garden much larger than the usual kitchen plots of the territory. A windmill creaked lazily beside a water tank, its silver blades catching the moonlight. Reed brought the wagon to a gentle stop before the house and set the brake. "We're here," he said, his voice startling after the long silence. "Let me help you inside." He lifted Josephine first, setting her carefully on the ground, then offered his hand to Eleanor, who hesitated only briefly before accepting his assistance. When he turned to Abigail, she instinctively clutched Ruby tighter. "I can manage," she said, struggling to rise. Reed stepped back immediately, respecting her boundary. "As you wish, Mrs. Porter." Abigail's legs betrayed her as she attempted to climb down from the wagon. She swayed dangerously, the world spinning around her. Before she could fall, Reed's hands were there, steadying, but not grasping, offering support, without demand. "Please," he said softly. "You'll injure yourself." After a moment's hesitation, Abigail nodded. With careful efficiency, Reed lifted her and Ruby together, supporting them, as if their combined weight were nothing. He carried them up the porch steps and through the front door, setting Abigail gently on a well-worn sofa before stepping back to a respectful distance. The interior of the house was simple but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a cheerful blaze already warming the room. Bookshelves lined another wall, more volumes than Abigail had seen outside the town's small lending library. A rocking chair sat angled toward the fire, a book open on its seat, as if the reader had just stepped away. "The bedroom is through there," Reed said, indicating a doorway. "There's clean water in the pitcher, and I'll heat more for washing. Are you hungry?" Before Abigail could answer, he was moving toward a small kitchen area, his actions efficient and practiced. "Eleanor, would you like to help me prepare something for your mother and sister?" He asked, his tone careful, giving the child the option to refuse. Eleanor looked to her mother for permission. Abigail nodded, sensing no threat in the man's demeanor. As Reed and Eleanor worked in the kitchen, Abigail noticed a closed door near the back of the house. Unlike the other doors, which stood partly open, This one was firmly shut, a small key visible in its lock. Something about it caught her attention, not just its secured state, but the way Reed's eyes moved to it each time he passed a brief glance, like a man checking that a precious possession remains safe. Josephine climbed onto the sofa beside her mother, her small body finally beginning to relax. "Pretty," she murmured, pointing to a carefully rendered drawing of a mountain landscape that hung above the mantel. "Yes, it is," Abigail agreed, shifting Ruby to better nurse her. The infant latched eagerly, bringing both relief to Abigail's swollen breasts and a deep maternal satisfaction. Reed returned with a tray bearing a simple meal, fresh bread, cold meat, and a pot of tea. Eleanor followed with plates and cups. Her movements careful and deliberate, clearly trying to impress with her usefulness. "It's not much," Reed said, setting the tray on a small table within Abigail's reach. "But it should help restore your strength." "Thank you," Abigail said, the words inadequate for the gratitude she felt. "You've been very kind." Reed inclined his head slightly, accepting her thanks without comment. He turned to leave the room, then paused. "There are nightclothes in the dresser," he said. "They belong to... They might be a bit large, but they're clean. I'll bring hot water for washing in a few minutes." He stepped outside, closing the door quietly behind him. Through the window, Abigail watched him cross to the barn, his figure outlined briefly against the night sky before disappearing into the shadowed interior. "Is this our home now, Mama?" Josephine asked, her voice small. Abigail stroked her daughter's hair. "Just for a little while, sweetheart. Just until Ruby is stronger, and we—" She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "Until we, what, return to Walter? Find somewhere else to go." There were no good answers. "I like it here," Eleanor said carefully, pouring a cup of tea for her mother. "It smells nice, not like whiskey." The simple observation brought tears to Abigail's eyes. How low their expectations had fallen, that the absence of the smell of alcohol could be counted as a luxury. Later, after Reed had brought hot water and then retreated again to the barn, Abigail bathed her daughters and herself. The borrowed nightgown, as Reed had warned, was too large, but the fabric was soft against her skin, a comfort she had almost forgotten existed. She settled the girls in the bed, a real bed with a proper mattress and clean linens that smelled of sunshine and lavender. Ruby, swaddled in a soft blanket Reed had produced from a chest, slept peacefully between her sisters. Abigail herself could not sleep. Her body ached for rest, but her mind raced with questions and fears. What would tomorrow bring? What would Walter do when his anger subsided and he remembered that wives were property not easily discarded? What did Reed want in return for his kindness? Experience had taught her that men's help always came with a price, usually extracted from her dignity or her body. She moved to the window, looking out at the barn where Reed had insisted on sleeping despite her protests that she could make do on the sofa. A soft light glowed from its interior, and after a moment, the gentle sounds of a harmonica drifted through the night air. The melody was unfamiliar but soothing, a slow, mournful tune that spoke of longing and memory. Abigail found herself drawn to the door, opening it just enough to better hear the music. Eleanor stirred, sitting up in bed. "I can't sleep, Mama," she whispered. "Everything feels strange." Before Abigail could respond, Reed's voice carried from the barn, not in song, but in story. His deep tones wove a tale about a fledgling bird that fell from its nest, but found a new home among the creatures of the forest floor, who taught it that family could be found in unexpected places. The story was simple, clearly improvised, but told with a storyteller's natural rhythm. Eleanor's eyes grew heavy as she listened, and soon she had curled back beside her sisters, her breathing deep and even. Abigail remained by the door, listening as Reed concluded his tale with the bird learning to fly and bringing gifts back to the forest creatures who had sheltered it. When the story ended, the harmonica began again, softer now, a lullaby. A movement on the porch caught her eye. Reed had placed a tray by the door, a glass of milk, a slice of bread with honey. A simple offering left without knocking, without expectation of thanks or acknowledgement. Tears pricked Abigail's eyes. She could not remember the last time someone had given without taking, had considered her needs without calculating what her gratitude might be worth. She returned to the bed, sliding carefully in beside her daughters. For the first time since Ruby's birth, perhaps for the first time in years, she felt the tension begin to leave her body. The girls slept without tears, without startling at shadows. Outside, the harmonica played on a gentle guardian, keeping watch through the night. Abigail's last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was a question she had no answer for. What kind of man gives shelter without seeking reward? Morning arrived with golden light filtering through curtains that hadn't been drawn. Abigail woke slowly, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. For a moment, panic seized her. Then she felt the warm weight of Ruby against her chest and remembered. Reed's home. Safety. At least for now. The bed beside her was empty, the imprints of Eleanor and Josephine's small bodies still visible on the quilt. From beyond the bedroom door came the soft murmur of children's voices and the homely clatter of cookware. Abigail rose, carefully mindful of her still tender body. She found her dress washed and dried overnight, folded neatly on a chair. The stains of childbirth and Walter's violence had been largely scrubbed away. After dressing and attending to Ruby, she made her way to the main room. The scene that greeted her stopped her in the doorway. Eleanor stood on a stool beside the stove, carefully stirring something in a cast-iron pan under Reed's watchful eye. Josephine sat at the table solemnly arranging wildflowers in a mason jar, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Reed noticed Abigail first. "Good morning, Mrs. Porter," he said, stepping back from the stove. "I hope we didn't wake you." "No," Abigail said, surprised by the domestic tableau. "I slept remarkably well." "Mama," Eleanor called, "Mr. Reed is teaching me to make corn cakes. Real ones, not just ash cakes." "I'm making pretty," Josephine announced, indicating her floral arrangement. Reed moved to pull out a chair for Abigail. "Please sit. You should be resting." Abigail hesitated, then took the offered seat. Ruby stirred against her chest, making small, rooting movements. "There's coffee," Reed said, pouring a cup without asking. "And Eleanor has indeed mastered the art of corn cakes." "Mr. Reed says I'm a natural," Eleanor said proudly, sliding a golden cake onto a plate. "He says I have good instincts." The praise had brought a flush of pleasure to the child's cheeks, a sight so rare that Abigail felt her throat tighten. When had Walter last offered their daughter anything but criticism? Breakfast passed in a surprisingly comfortable silence. Reed ate quickly, efficiently, his manner suggesting long habit rather than haste. He asked no questions, made no demands for explanation or gratitude. When Ruby began to fuss, he simply rose and busied himself outside, giving Abigail privacy to nurse. After the meal, Reed showed them around the small ranch. The garden proved to be not just large, but meticulously organized with sections for vegetables, herbs, and even flowers. A small greenhouse constructed from salvaged window panes sheltered seedlings and more delicate plants from the desert's extremes. "Are you a gardener, Mr. Reed?" Abigail asked, genuinely curious. "No," he replied, his gaze fixed on something distant. "My wife was. I simply maintain what she began." The statement, delivered without elaboration, hung in the air between them. Abigail sensed a depth of feeling behind the simple words, but knew better than to pry. As they returned to the house, Reed paused by a large apple tree that stood a short distance from the back porch. Unlike the rest of the property, which showed evidence of careful tending, the area beneath the tree had been left natural. Wildflowers grew among the grasses, and a simple wooden bench had been placed to catch the afternoon shade. "This was Sarah's favorite place," Reed said quietly, almost to himself. Then, seeming to remember Abigail's presence, he added more formally, "You're welcome to sit here when you wish for quiet." Inside the house, he showed Eleanor where the books were kept, his manner warming as he discovered the child's excitement over the collection. "You can read?" He asked, no judgment in his tone, only interest. Eleanor nodded shyly. "Mama taught me, but we don't have many books." "Then these are at your disposal," Reed said seriously, as if making a business arrangement with an equal, "provided you handle them with care." "I will," Eleanor promised, already reaching for a volume with a faded green cover. Throughout the day, Abigail watched Reed with her daughters, searching for signs of impatience or hidden motive. She found none. He answered their questions directly, showed them how the pump in the kitchen worked, and even spent an hour fashioning a small cloth doll for Josephine from scraps and cotton batting. His interactions with Abigail herself were unfailingly polite but reserved, as if he sensed her wariness and respected it. He asked no personal questions, made no reference to Walter or the circumstances that had brought them to his door. That evening, after the girls had been settled in bed, Abigail found Reed on the porch, whittling by lamplight. The shavings fell in pale curls around his boots, and a small wooden horse was taking shape beneath his knife. "Mr. Reed," she began nervously, smoothing her skirt, "I wanted to thank you properly for your kindness." He glanced up, his knife pausing. "There's no need, Mrs. Porter." "There is," she insisted. "You've opened your home to strangers, given us food and shelter. I need to know what you expect in return." Reed's expression shifted, understanding dawning in his eyes. He carefully set aside his knife and the half-finished carving. "Mrs. Porter," he said, his voice gentler than she had yet heard it, "I expect nothing from you. Not anything." Abigail struggled to accept his words, to believe that such unexpected generosity could come without conditions. "Then why?" she asked the question that had haunted her through the day. "Why help us?" Reed was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains barely visible in the fading light. "I was a doctor once," he said finally, "in Boston then, during the war. I took an oath to do no harm, but also to help where I could." He paused, turning the wooden horse over in his hands. "I haven't practiced medicine properly in years, but some habits of thought remain." It wasn't a complete answer, Abigail sensed, but it was as much as he was willing to share for now. "How long?" she asked the question that had been foremost in her mind all day. "How long may we stay?" "As long as you need," Reed replied without hesitation. "The house has stood empty of family for too long." Something in his phrasing caught Abigail's attention. Empty of family, not empty entirely. She thought of the locked room, of the careful way Reed maintained a garden he claimed not to care for. "Your wife," she said carefully. "May I ask about her?" A shadow passed over Reed's face, but he answered steadily. "Sarah. Her name was Sarah. She died 8 years ago, along with our twin daughters. A snowstorm. I couldn't reach them in time." The simple statement contained worlds of pain, carefully controlled, but still raw beneath the surface. "I'm sorry," Abigail said, the words inadequate but sincere. Reed nodded once, accepting her sympathy without comment. He rose, tucking the wooden horse into his pocket. "You should rest, Mrs. Porter," he said. "Tomorrow will bring its own concerns." As he moved toward the barn, Abigail called after him. "Mr. Reed," he paused, looking back. "My name is Abigail," she said. "If we're to share your home even temporarily, perhaps you could use it." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Maxwell," he offered in return. "Though most folks here just call me Reed." "Good night, Maxwell," Abigail said, testing the name. "Good night, Abigail," he replied, and continued toward the barn, his figure soon swallowed by the gathering darkness. The days settled into an unexpected rhythm. Each morning Maxwell rose before dawn, completing the essential ranch chores before Abigail and the girls woke. Breakfast would be waiting, simple but nourishing, and he would eat quickly before excusing himself to tend the garden or work in the small smithy attached to the barn. Abigail, finding herself with time and energy not consumed by fear, began to explore the house more thoroughly. The bookshelves yielded treasures beyond counting medical texts, certainly, but also poetry history, even novels that she had heard of, but never had the opportunity to read. One volume in particular caught her attention, a collection of herbal remedies, handwritten in a delicate feminine script. The inside cover bore an inscription, "To my beloved Maxwell, that you might learn to heal with what grows beneath your feet, as well as with your surgeon's tools. All my love, Sarah." Abigail ran her fingers over the words, feeling like an intruder in a private moment. She carefully replaced the book, but her curiosity about Sarah Reed grew. The locked room remained a mystery. Maxwell never mentioned it, and Abigail did not ask, respecting his privacy as he respected hers. But sometimes passing it in the night, she would hear the softest sounds from within, not movement, but perhaps the whisper of pages being turned or the gentle click of something being set down. Ruby thrived in the peaceful environment. Her newborn fussiness gave way to alert curiosity, her eyes tracking movement, her tiny hands grasping at the world around her. Josephine blossomed as well, her natural shyness receding as she explored the garden under Maxwell's patient supervision. But it was Eleanor who underwent the most remarkable transformation. The weight of responsibility that had bent her young shoulders began to ease. She followed Maxwell like a shadow, absorbing his quiet explanations of how things grew, how the windmill drew water, how a poultice could draw infection from a wound. One afternoon Abigail found them by the garden, Eleanor solemnly grinding dried herbs in a small mortar, while Maxwell explained their properties. "Yarrow stops bleeding," Eleanor recited carefully. "Comfrey helps bones knit. Willow bark eases pain." "Very good," Maxwell said, his usual reserve softening. "And what's this one?" He held up a sprig of something with tiny purple flowers. Eleanor's brow furrowed in concentration. "That's thyme for coughs and cleaning wounds." "Excellent. You have a fine memory." The pride in Eleanor's face at this simple praise made Abigail's heart ache. She slipped away without disturbing them, unwilling to interrupt this gentle lesson that was healing wounds far deeper than any that herbs could touch. That evening, as Abigail sat on the porch mending one of Josephine's dresses, Maxwell emerged from the barn carrying something wrapped in oilcloth. "I thought the girls might enjoy this," he said, unfolding the package to reveal a kite fashioned from sticks and brightly colored fabric scraps. "If you approve, of course." The deference to her authority as a mother, the acknowledgement that these decisions were hers to make, struck Abigail forcefully. Walter had never once consulted her on matters regarding the children, had simply imposed his will without consideration. "They would love it," she said, smiling despite herself. "Thank you," Maxwell nodded, seemingly pleased by her approval. He started to return to the barn, then paused. "There's a book," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "On the third shelf. Folk Tales of Old England. Eleanor mentioned you used to read to them at night." Abigail felt a flush of pleasure at his thoughtfulness. "I did. Before Walter decided it filled their heads with nonsense." Maxwell's expression hardened momentarily, then cleared. "No child ever suffered from too many stories," he said. "Good night, Abigail." Later, after finding the book and reading to the girls until they drifted off, Abigail returned to the porch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the desert sky like diamonds on black velvet. From the barn came the soft, familiar notes of the harmonica. Abigail closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. It occurred to her that for the first time in years, she felt truly safe. Not just physically protected, but emotionally secure, free from the constant vigilance that life with Walter had required. The thought brought with it a flutter of panic. Safety was an illusion. Walter would not simply let them go. Sooner or later he would come for them, for her, and this fragile peace would shatter. The music stopped abruptly. Abigail opened her eyes to find Maxwell standing at the foot of the porch steps, his expression concerned. "Are you unwell?" he asked. "You looked distressed." Abigail shook her head, embarrassed to have been caught in her moment of fear. "Just thinking." Maxwell studied her face, seeming to read more than she had intended to reveal. After a moment, he climbed the steps and took a seat on the bench opposite her, maintaining a respectful distance. "He'll come," Abigail said, the words escaping before she could contain them. "Walter, when the whiskey wears off, and he remembers that a wife is property under the law." Maxwell was silent for a long moment, his face unreadable in the shadows. "Yes," he agreed finally, "he likely will." The simple acknowledgement, free of false reassurances, was oddly comforting. Maxwell would not lie to her, even to ease her fears. "What will you do when he does?" she asked. "That depends," he replied carefully, "on what you wish to do." Again, the deference to her choice, the recognition of her agency, left Abigail momentarily speechless. She had spent so long having decisions made for her that the freedom to choose her own path was almost frightening. "I don't know," she admitted. I never believed I could leave." Maxwell nodded, unsurprised. "You have time to consider. A few days at least. More if we're fortunate. And if we're not," the question barely audible. "Then we'll face that when it comes," Maxwell said, rising. "But know this, Abigail, I meant what I said that night. You and your daughters are welcome here for as long as you choose to stay." He bid her good night and returned to the barn, leaving Abigail to ponder the strange turns her life had taken. A week ago, she had been Walter Porter's wife, her existence defined by his moods and demands. Now she sat on another man's porch, considering possibilities that had once seemed as distant as the stars above. The next morning brought a change to their routine. Maxwell, finishing his breakfast quickly, as usual, paused before leaving for his chores. "I need to ride into town for supplies," he said. "Is there anything specific you need?" The question, like so many of his small courtesies, caught Abigail off guard. When had anyone last asked what she needed? "Perhaps some cloth," she suggested tentatively. "If it's not too much trouble. For diapers for Ruby." Maxwell nodded. "Of course. Anything else?" Abigail hesitated, then said, "Some paper, perhaps, and a pencil. For Eleanor. She loves to draw." "Consider it done." He reached for his hat, then added almost as an afterthought, "I may be late returning. There's a family out near Coyote Creek whose boy has a fever. They asked if I'd look in on him." Abigail nodded, adding this new piece to her understanding of the complex man before her. Though he claimed to have abandoned his profession, it seemed the community still called on his skills when needed. "We'll be fine," she assured him. "The girls and I can manage." A ghost of a smile touched Maxwell's lips. "I don't doubt it." After he'd gone, Abigail found herself at loose ends. The house was already clean, the morning chores complete. On impulse, she took the girls to the apple tree Maxwell had shown her days earlier. The tree was ancient, its gnarled trunk speaking of decades of desert summers and winter frosts. Yet it still bore fruit, small, wizened apples that nonetheless contained surprising sweetness. "Can we climb it, Mama?" Eleanor asked, eyeing the low branches with interest. In Walter's house, such a request would have been met with a swift refusal. Climbing was for boys, and besides, Eleanor might tear her dress. But here, in this place of unexpected freedoms, Abigail found herself nodding. "Be careful," she cautioned, "and help your sister." The girls' delight was payment enough for any worry. They scrambled into the lower branches, their laughter floating down like the apple blossoms that occasionally drifted on the breeze. Abigail settled on the bench beneath the tree, Ruby sleeping peacefully in her arms. From this vantage point, she could see most of the small ranch, the house with its welcoming porch, the barn where Maxwell slept, despite her repeated offers to trade places, the garden, with its neat rows and riot of medicinal herbs. A home. Not hers, she reminded herself firmly. A temporary sanctuary, nothing more. Her gaze was drawn to a small plot beyond the garden, set apart by a low stone wall. 3 crosses stood within the enclosure, 2 smaller than the third. The family burial ground, she realized, with a pang. Sarah Reed and the twin daughters Maxwell had mentioned. The discovery sobered her. This peaceful place had known its share of sorrow. Yet Maxwell had continued, had maintained the garden his wife loved, had built a life amid the ruins of his hopes. There was a lesson in that, if she was wise enough to recognize it. The day passed in quiet contentment. Abigail found bread and cold meat in the kitchen for their midday meal. In the afternoon, she read to the girls from the book of folk tales, their small bodies pressed against hers, as they listened with rapt attention to stories of brave maidens and enchanted forests. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in impossible shades of gold and crimson, Abigail felt a flicker of concern. Maxwell had not returned. "Is Mr. Reed coming back?" Josephine asked, echoing her thoughts. "Of course he is," Abigail assured her with more confidence than she felt. "He's helping a sick child. That can take time." She prepared a simple supper from the supplies in Maxwell's well-stocked pantry, then settled the girls in the big bed. Eleanor, unusually subdued, asked for an extra story. "Are you worried about Mr. Reed?" Abigail asked, brushing the child's hair back from her forehead. Eleanor nodded. "What if the bad men get him?" The question revealed depths of fear Abigail hadn't realized her daughter carried. In Eleanor's world, shaped by Walter's unpredictable violence, danger lurked everywhere. "Mr. Reed is very capable," Abigail said gently, "and there are no bad men out tonight." "But Papa, your father is in town," Abigail said firmly, "and he won't come here." The reassurance felt hollow even as she spoke it. Walter would come eventually, but not tonight, she prayed silently. Please, not tonight. After the girls were asleep, Abigail found herself too restless to retire. She moved about the house, straightening things that didn't need straightening, rereading pages of books without absorbing their content. When the creak of wagon wheels finally sounded in the yard, she hurried to the door, relief washing over her with unexpected intensity. Maxwell climbed down from the wagon slowly, his movements stiff with fatigue. Even in the dim light of the moon, Abigail could see that his shirt was stained, his face drawn. "The boy?" she asked as he mounted the porch steps. "Will live," Maxwell replied wearily, though it was a near thing. Pneumonia. He swayed slightly, and Abigail reached out instinctively to steady him. Her hand closed around his forearm, feeling the solid strength beneath his sleeve. It was the first time she had touched him voluntarily. "You should eat," she said, suddenly aware of the contact. She withdrew her hand, flustered by her own boldness. "I kept supper warm." Maxwell looked down at his soiled clothing. "I should clean up first." "Of course. I'll heat water." The easy domesticity of the exchange struck them both at the same moment. Maxwell's eyes met hers, surprise evident in their depths. Then something else flickered there, a warmth quickly banked. "Thank you, Abigail," he said quietly. Later, as he ate the simple meal she had prepared, Abigail found herself studying him with new eyes. The fatigue that marked his features spoke of hours spent fighting for a child's life. The careful way he ate, ensuring not a crumb was wasted, revealed both good manners and the habits of a man who had known hunger. "You were worried," he observed, setting down his fork. Abigail started to deny it, then reconsidered. "Yes," she admitted. "The girls were concerned when you didn't return by sunset." "The girls," he repeated, a slight emphasis on the plural that made her flush. "And I," she conceded. It's easy to forget how dangerous the territory can be, even for those accustomed to its ways. Maxwell nodded, accepting the explanation without pressing further. "I should have sent word. I apologize for causing concern." "There's no need," Abigail said quickly. "This is your home. You come and go as you please." "Nevertheless," he insisted, "it was thoughtless. It won't happen again." The promise, like all his words, carried the weight of complete sincerity. Abigail had no doubt he would keep it, just as he had kept his word about the barn, about respecting her boundaries, about welcoming her daughters. As she rose to clear away his plate, Maxwell spoke again, his voice carefully neutral. "I saw Walter in town." Abigail froze her hand halfway to the empty dish. "He was at the saloon," Maxwell continued, "drinking heavily, talking to anyone who would listen about how his wife had abandoned him." A bitter laugh escaped Abigail before she could prevent it. "Abandoned, as if he didn't throw us out like unwanted puppies." "Men like Walter rarely acknowledge their own actions," Maxwell said, a hardness entering his tone. "They rewrite the world to suit their needs." Did he say anything about coming for us?" Abigail asked, dreading the answer. "Not directly, but he will, Abigail, when his pride demands it or when he needs something from you." The blunt assessment, delivered without sugarcoating, was exactly what she needed. Not false comfort, but truth, however painful. "What should I do?" she asked, not expecting an answer, but needing to voice the question that had haunted her since their arrival. Maxwell was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the wall behind her, as if seeing something beyond the confines of the room. "What do you want to do?" he asked finally. "Not what you think you should do, or what others expect. What do you, Abigail Porter, truly want?" The question struck her like a physical blow. What did she want? Had anyone ever asked her that before? Had she ever asked herself? "I want my daughters to be safe," she said slowly, "to grow up without fear, to know they have value beyond their usefulness to a man." She paused, then added in a near whisper, "I want to be more than Walter Porter's wife." Maxwell nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he had already known. "Then that is what we'll work toward," he said simply. Abigail stared at him, momentarily speechless. "Just like that. Just like that," he confirmed, rising from the table, "though I don't imagine it will be simple in execution." He moved toward the door, then paused, turning back to face her. "Abigail," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "whatever happens, remember this: you have choices, more than you realize." With that, he bid her good night and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Abigail to contemplate words that fell on her ears like rain on parched earth. Choices, more than she realized. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly consider possibilities beyond returning to Walter or finding another man to depend on. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a great height and feeling the urge to spread one's arms and leap. That night, as she lay beside her sleeping daughters, Abigail made a decision. She would not passively await whatever fate Walter or circumstance decreed for her. She would act, would shape her own future as best she could. The how of it remained unclear, but the resolution itself felt like the first step on a journey long delayed. Abigail woke before dawn, the habits of years rising with her, despite the absence of Walter's demands. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the soft breathing of her daughters and the distant sounds of Maxwell moving about the barn. The familiar creak of the pump handle, the gentle nickering of his horse, the rhythmic scrape of a pitchfork, the morning symphony of a working ranch. She slipped from the bed, careful not to disturb the girls, and dressed quickly in the half-light. Ruby would wake soon, hungry, but for now Abigail had a rare moment to herself. On impulse, she took a shawl from the hook by the door and stepped outside. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. The eastern horizon glowed with the promise of sunrise stars still visible in the western sky. Maxwell stood by the corral, his back to the house, feeding his horse. He wore no coat, despite the morning chill, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with lean muscle. Abigail hesitated, reluctant to intrude on his solitude, but something drew her forward across the yard. He turned at the sound of her approach, surprise evident in the slight raising of his eyebrows. "You're up early," he observed, his voice rougher than usual, not yet smoothed by the day's use. "Old habits," Abigail replied, drawing the shawl closer around her shoulders. Walter expected breakfast on the table when he woke, regardless of the hour. Maxwell's expression darkened momentarily at the mention of her husband. "You're not obligated to cook here," he said. "Not as payment for staying." "I know," Abigail said, realizing with mild surprise that she did. "But I'd like to contribute something for your hospitality." Maxwell nodded, accepting her desire to reciprocate without making her feel it was expected. "Coffee should be ready in the kitchen," he said. "I put the pot on before coming out." Another small kindness, Abigail thought. The man seemed to dispense them as naturally as breathing. "There's something I'd like to show you," Maxwell said after a brief silence, "if you have a moment before the girls wake." Curiosity piqued, Abigail nodded. "They'll sleep a while yet. Ruby had a restless night." Maxwell led her past the garden to a small outbuilding she had noticed but not explored. Unlike the barn, which was built of rough-hewn planks, this structure had been constructed with more care. Its walls of adobe brick, whitewashed to a pale gleam in the growing light. He produced a key from his pocket and unlocked the door, pushing it open to reveal an unexpected sight. A doctor's office. Small, but well-equipped, with shelves of labeled bottles and jars, a narrow examination table covered with clean linen, and a desk bearing neat stacks of paper and leather-bound journals. "Your surgery," Abigail said, taking it in with wide eyes. Maxwell nodded. "Such as it is. Nothing like what I had in Boston, but it serves the needs of those who can't reach the doctor in Silver City. But you said you'd stopped practicing medicine. I said I haven't practiced properly in years, he corrected gently. I do what I can for those who ask. Set bones, stitch wounds, deliver babies when the midwife is unavailable. Abigail moved deeper into the room, drawn to the shelves of medicines and herbs. Many she recognized from her father's occasional visits to the doctor in her childhood. "Why show me this?" she asked, turning to face him. Maxwell leaned against the door frame, his expression thoughtful. "Because I saw how you splinted Josephine's doll's arm yesterday. A perfect miniature reduction of a fracture." A hint of a smile touched his lips. Not a skill most acquire without training. Abigail felt heat rise in her cheeks. My father taught me some basic first aid. For the forge, burns and cuts were common. He taught you well, Maxwell said. He hesitated, then added, I could teach you more if you're interested. Not to overstep, but with 3 active daughters, such knowledge might prove useful. The offer was presented casually, as if teaching a woman medical skills were the most natural thing in the world. Abigail had heard of female doctors. Of course, there were a few now, even in the territories, but the idea that she might learn such things had never occurred to her. I'd like that, she said softly, surprised by her own quick acceptance. Maxwell nodded, seemingly pleased. We'll begin whenever you're ready. Nothing formal. Just practical knowledge that might serve you well. He moved to the desk, opening a drawer to retrieve something. I bought these in town yesterday, he said, holding out a package wrapped in brown paper. For Eleanor. Abigail unwrapped it to find a set of drawing pencils and a small bound sketchbook of quality paper. The gift was simple but thoughtful, and far more expensive than the crude slate and chalk Walter had reluctantly provided when Eleanor first showed interest in letters. This is too generous, she protested. It's nothing, Maxwell said dismissively. The child has talent. She should have proper tools to develop it. Before Abigail could respond, a call came from the direction of the house. Mama! Mama! Where are you? Eleanor stood on the porch, her nightdress fluttering around her ankles, her face pinched with worry. Here, sweetheart, Abigail called, hurrying toward the house. I'm just talking with Mr. Reed. Relief washed over Eleanor's features, followed by embarrassment at her obvious panic. I didn't know where you were, she explained, as Abigail climbed the steps to embrace her. I'm sorry for worrying you, Abigail said, understanding all too well the fears that haunted her eldest. For a child who had seen her mother beaten for the smallest infractions, any unexplained absence triggered deep-seated terrors. Maxwell had followed more slowly, giving them space for their reunion. Now he mounted the porch steps, the package for Eleanor in his hands. Good morning, Miss Eleanor, he said formally. I believe these are for you. Eleanor accepted the package with wide eyes, looking to her mother for permission before unwrapping it. Her gasp of delight when the pencils and sketchbook were revealed sent a wave of warmth through Abigail's chest. For me, really. The child's voice trembled with excitement. Really, Maxwell confirmed. Your mother tells me you enjoy drawing. These should serve you better than charcoal. Eleanor threw her arms around Maxwell's waist before either adult could react, her face pressed against his stomach in a spontaneous embrace. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Maxwell stood frozen for a moment, clearly taken aback by the display of affection. Then, with infinite gentleness, he placed a hand on Eleanor's head, the gesture awkward but sincere. You're very welcome, he said, his voice rougher than usual. Perhaps you could draw the apple tree for me sometime. It was It was a favorite subject of someone I knew. Eleanor nodded eagerly, already clutching her new treasures close. I'll draw it today. The best picture ever. As the child rushed back into the house to show Josephine her bounty, Abigail found herself blinking back unexpected tears. Such a small thing, really, pencils and paper, yet the joy they brought illuminated how starved for simple kindnesses her daughters had been. "Thank you," she said softly to Maxwell, "not just for the gift, but for how you gave it, for treating her as someone of value." Maxwell's gaze, when it met hers, held a complexity of emotion she couldn't fully decipher. "Children should never doubt their worth," he said simply. The words hung in the air between them, layered with meaning beyond their surface. In them, Abigail heard not only his belief, but an indictment of Walter of a world that measured human value by utility rather than inherent dignity. Before she could respond, Ruby's cries sounded from within the house, the hungry demands of a newborn, unconcerned with adult conversation. "Duty calls," Abigail said with a small smile. Maxwell nodded, already turning toward the barn. "I'll see to the rest of the chores," he said. "Take your time with breakfast." As he walked away, Abigail found herself watching him with new eyes, not just as a benefactor or a safe harbor in her storm, but as a man, complex, wounded, yet possessed of a fundamental decency that seemed to flow from some deep, hidden spring. Dangerous thoughts, she warned herself. Walter was still her husband in the eyes of the law. She had no right to notice the breadth of another man's shoulders or the gentle way his hands moved when tending to a child's needs. Still, as she turned to attend to Ruby, Abigail couldn't help but wonder what it might be like to live always in the calm certainty of Maxwell Reed's regard rather than the capricious storm of Walter Porter's demands. The days that followed fell into a pattern both comforting and unfamiliar. Mornings were for household tasks and lessons, Maxwell teaching Eleanor the basics of anatomy as she drew increasingly sophisticated pictures of plants and animals. Abigail instructing Josephine in her letters, baby Ruby growing stronger and more alert with each passing day. Afternoons often found them in the garden or under the apple tree, the girls playing while Abigail and Maxwell worked side by side, comfortable silences punctuated by occasional conversation that grew easier with time. In the evenings after the girls were asleep, they would sit on the porch, Maxwell whittling or mending tack, Abigail sewing or reading from one of his many books. Sometimes they spoke of small things, the weather, the garden's progress, the funny thing Josephine had said at dinner. Sometimes they sat in silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. Always Maxwell retired to the barn, despite Abigail's continued protests that he should reclaim his bed. Always, she found herself watching his retreating figure with a mixture of gratitude and something more complex that she refused to name. It was during one of these evenings, nearly 2 weeks after their arrival, that Maxwell brought up the subject they had both been carefully avoiding. "Walter was asking about you in town today," he said, his knife pausing in its steady shaving of a piece of pine. Abigail's hands stilled on the shirt she was mending. "You went to town?" Maxwell nodded. "While you were teaching Josephine, I needed supplies from the apothecary." He hesitated, then added, "I should have mentioned it." "It's your home," Abigail reminded him, though the idea that he had gone to Buckskin without telling her sent an unexpected pang through her chest. "You don't need my permission to come and go." "Nevertheless," Maxwell said, "I should have told you, especially given what I learned." Abigail braced herself. "What did Walter say?" "Not to me directly. Martha Wilson overheard him at the general store talking to Sheriff Haynes." Maxwell set down his whittling, giving her his full attention. "He's considering legal action to reclaim you and the girls. Though Abigail had been expecting something of the sort, the confirmation still struck her like a physical blow. "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Abandonment, apparently," Maxwell said, a rare edge of anger in his tone. "He's claiming you left of your own accord, taking his children with you." A bitter laugh escaped Abigail's lips. "After he threw us into the yard like garbage." Mrs. Wilson made a point of correcting his version of events. Maxwell said, loudly and in front of several witnesses, "It seems your departure was not as private as Walter might have preferred." The thought of Martha Wilson, the elderly widow who ran the lending library and was generally considered the moral authority of Buckskin, publicly contradicting Walter, brought Abigail a small measure of comfort. "Will it make a difference?" she asked, already suspecting the answer. Maxwell's silence was confirmation enough. In the eyes of the law, Walter's claim over her and the children was nearly absolute. A wife was property, her children extensions of her husband's authority. "What should I do?" Abigail asked the question that had become a refrain between them. This time Maxwell didn't deflect with a question of his own. "Prepare," he said simply. "Consider your options carefully." "Do I have options?" The question emerged more bitter than she had intended. "More than you might think," Maxwell said. He leaned forward, his expression intent. "The law may favor Walter, but public opinion in Buckskin is not entirely on his side. Mrs. Wilson is respected. Her account of his behavior carries weight. Public opinion won't stop a court order," Abigail pointed out. "No," Maxwell conceded, "but it might influence how vigorously such an order is enforced." He paused, choosing his next words with evident care. "And there are other possibilities we might consider." Abigail's heart quickened. "Such as, you could leave the territory," Maxwell suggested. "I have contacts in California, in Oregon. Places where a woman with your skills might start fresh." The offer was generous, perhaps the most generous, yet considering what it would cost him, in terms of potential legal consequences. Yet Abigail found herself strangely reluctant to consider it. "Running," she said softly. "Always looking over my shoulder, wondering if Walter has followed." "It would be difficult," Maxwell acknowledged. "But possible. You wouldn't be the first woman to disappear into the vastness of the West." Abigail studied his face in the fading light, searching for some hint of his own preference in the matter. As always, he offered information without pressing for a particular course of action, respecting her right to make her own choices, even when those choices might affect him deeply. "I need to think," she said finally. Maxwell nodded, rising to his feet. "Of course. There's no need to decide tonight." He gathered his whittling materials, preparing to retire to the barn. "Whatever you choose, Abigail, know that you have my support." The words, simple and sincere, settled around her like a warm blanket against the evening's cooling air. Whatever you choose. Not directions, not demands. Support for her own decision, whatever it might be. "Thank you, Maxwell," she said, the words inadequate for the depth of feeling behind them. He paused at the top of the porch steps, looking back at her with an expression that made her breath catch. For a moment, something hung between them, unspoken, yet almost palpable in the gathering twilight. Then he nodded once and descended the steps, his figure soon swallowed by the darkness between porch and barn. Abigail remained on the porch long after he had gone, her thoughts swirling like autumn leaves in a dust devil. Leave the territory. Start fresh in a place where no one knew her as Walter Porter's wife. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had skills, could read and write better than many men in the territories knew, basic first aid, could cook and sew and manage a household. With Maxwell's help, she might indeed find a place where those abilities would allow her to support herself and her daughters. Yet, Something held her back from embracing the plan wholeheartedly. Something beyond the practical difficulties of such a journey or the risks of Walter pursuing them. She didn't want to leave. Didn't want to leave this house, this ranch. Didn't want to leave Maxwell Reed and the quiet strength he offered without demand or expectation. The realization shook her. When had this temporary refuge begun to feel like home? When had its owner begun to occupy such a central place in her thoughts? Dangerous, she reminded herself again. She was still married, still bound by laws and vows, however one-sided their observance had become. To allow herself to develop feelings for Maxwell was to invite complications that neither of them needed. Yet, as she finally rose and went inside, Abigail couldn't deny the truth that had been growing within her heart. Like one of Maxwell's carefully tended herbs, she was falling in love with the quiet doctor who had opened his home and his heart to her daughters, who treated her with a respect she had almost forgotten she deserved. The knowledge settled within her, neither welcome nor entirely unwelcome, simply a fact to be acknowledged and carefully contained. Like the jar of nitroglycerin she had once seen her father handle for a mining company, powerful, potentially life-changing, but volatile if mishandled. For now, she would focus on the immediate problem, what to do about Walter and his legal threats. The other matter, the feeling stirring in her heart, would have to wait for a time when her future and her children's safety were more secure. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the autumn air crisp with the promise of winter to come. Abigail rose early, her dreams having offered no solution to her dilemma, but having left her with a renewed determination to face whatever came with courage. She found Maxwell in the kitchen, already dressed for the day, a pot of coffee brewing on the stove. He looked up at her entrance, his expression carefully neutral. "Good morning," he said, pouring a cup and offering it to her. "Did you sleep well?" "Well enough," Abigail replied, accepting the coffee with a grateful nod. "Though my dreams were restless." Maxwell nodded, understanding without need for elaboration. "I've been thinking," he said, leaning against the counter, "about your situation with Walter." Abigail took a sip of coffee, savoring its rich bitterness. "And there might be a third option beyond staying to face him or fleeing the territory." Curious despite her caution, Abigail gestured for him to continue. "You could petition for divorce," Maxwell said, watching her face carefully for her reaction. The cup froze halfway to Abigail's lips. Divorce. The word itself seemed to carry a stigma, a whisper of failure and shame. Yet, beneath that, a flicker of possibility. "On what grounds?" she asked, setting the cup down to hide the sudden tremor in her hands. "Walter would never agree." "Cruelty," Maxwell said simply. "Abandonment. There are witnesses to both." Abigail shook her head slowly. No court in the territory would grant a divorce to a woman on those grounds alone. Not without evidence of more severe abuse. "Perhaps," Maxwell conceded, "but it would buy time. Force Walter to defend his actions publicly. And in that time, circumstances might change." The careful phrasing caught Abigail's attention. Circumstances might change. What did he mean? That Walter might tire of the fight? That public opinion might swing further against him, or something else entirely? Before she could ask, the patter of small feet announced Eleanor's arrival in the kitchen, Josephine trailing sleepily behind her. "Good morning, Mama." "Good morning, Mr. Reed," Eleanor said formally, clearly having rehearsed the greeting. "May we have corn cakes again? Please." The adult conversation was necessarily set aside as breakfast preparations took precedence. By the time the girls were fed and dressed for the day, Maxwell had already departed for the barn, leaving Abigail to ponder his suggestion without the distraction of his presence. Divorce. The word kept returning to her thoughts as she moved through the morning chores. Even a year ago, she would have dismissed the idea out of hand. A divorced woman faced not only legal and financial challenges, but social ostracism. Few respectable doors would open to her. Yet here, in this place, with Maxwell Reed's support, might it be possible not just to survive as a divorced woman, but to thrive, to build a life defined by her own choices rather than a husband's demands? The more she considered it, the more the idea appealed to her. Not as an easy solution, there would be nothing easy about the legal battle ahead, but as a statement of intent. A declaration that she, Abigail Porter, was reclaiming her life. Her contemplation was interrupted by a cry from the yard. She rushed to the door to find Josephine sprawled beneath the apple tree, tears streaming down her face. Eleanor knelt beside her, examining her sister's knee with the seriousness of a physician twice her age. "She fell climbing," Eleanor explained as Abigail hurried over. "I told her to be careful, but she wanted to go higher." The injury was minor, a scraped knee bleeding, but not deeply. Abigail scooped Josephine into her arms, murmuring soothing words as she carried her toward the house. "Let's clean that up," she said. "Then we'll put on a bandage just like Mr. Reed taught us." To her surprise, Maxwell emerged from the surgery, alerted by Josephine's cries. "What happened?" he asked, his tone professional but concerned. "Falling accident," Abigail reported, nodding toward the apple tree. "Nothing serious, just a scrape." Maxwell nodded, his posture relaxing slightly. "Would you like me to take a look?" Though Abigail knew she could handle the minor injury, she recognized the offer as Maxwell's way of showing concern without overstepping. "That would be reassuring," she said. "Josephine, would you like Mr. Reed to make your knee better?" The child nodded through her tears, clearly viewing Maxwell as a figure of almost magical healing powers after watching him tend to various minor injuries around the ranch. In the surgery, Maxwell cleaned the wound with the same care he might have given a more serious injury, explaining each step to both Josephine and Eleanor, who watched with rapt attention. "Now," he said, reaching for a jar on one of the shelves, "we'll put on some of this special salve. It will help your skin heal faster and keep away any infection." "What's it made from?" Eleanor asked, ever curious. "Calendula and comfrey, primarily," Maxwell replied, treating the question with complete seriousness, "with a bit of yarrow and a touch of honey to help it stick." "Did you make it?" Josephine asked, momentarily distracted from her pain by interest in the sweet-smelling ointment. A shadow crossed Maxwell's face, brief but noticeable. "No," he said quietly. "My wife did. Sarah. She was very skilled with herbs and healing." It was the most he had voluntarily shared about Sarah since mentioning her death that first night. Abigail felt a surge of curiosity, but held her questions, sensing the delicacy of the moment. After the injury had been properly bandaged and Josephine dispatched with a piece of rock candy for her bravery, Abigail lingered in the surgery, drawn by the rare glimpse into Maxwell's past. "Your wife," she said carefully. "She was interested in medicine." Maxwell busied himself with returning the supplies to their proper places, his back to her. "Yes," he said after a moment. "She was studying to become a nurse when we met. Her father disapproved, thought it unseemly for a lady of her standing, but Sarah was determined." The fondness in his voice was unmistakable, tinged with the familiar notes of grief, but not overwhelmed by them. "She sounds remarkable," Abigail said softly. Maxwell turned to face her, his expression more open than she had yet seen it. "She was," he agreed, "brilliant, stubborn kind. She saw possibilities where others saw only barriers." He paused, then added, "She would have liked you, I think, and your daughters." The simple statement offered without artifice touched Abigail deeply. "I wish I could have known her," she said sincerely. Maxwell nodded, accepting the sentiment for what it was: not empty condolence, but genuine regret for a connection never made. "The herbs in the garden were hers," he said, continuing the rare moment of openness. She believed in the healing power of plants long before it was fashionable among Boston physicians, learned from her grandmother, who had been a midwife in rural Massachusetts. "And you maintained her garden," Abigail observed. "All these years." "It seemed important," Maxwell said simply, "to preserve something she had created with such care." The conversation might have continued, this tentative sharing of personal history, had not the sound of hoofbeats in the yard drawn their attention. Maxwell moved to the window, his posture instantly alert. "Martha Wilson," he reported, relaxing slightly. "Riding alone." Abigail joined him at the window, curious about this unexpected visitor. Martha Wilson rarely left town, preferring to hold court from her domain in the lending library, dispensing books and advice in equal measure to those who sought either. They met the elderly woman on the porch, Maxwell helping her dismount with careful respect for both her age and her dignity. "Mrs. Wilson," he greeted her formally, "this is an unexpected pleasure." Martha Wilson was a formidable presence despite her diminutive size. Barely 5 feet tall, with a spine straight as a ramrod and silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, she carried herself with the assurance of a woman who had outlived 2 husbands and buried a son without surrendering to grief or bitterness. "Mr. Reed," she acknowledged with a nod. "Mrs. Porter, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but matters in town have taken a turn that you should be aware of." Maxwell gestured toward the porch chairs. "Please sit. You've had a long ride." Once settled with a cup of coffee that Abigail hastily prepared, Martha Wilson came directly to the point. "Walter Porter has been talking to Judge Hammond," she said without preamble. "He's seeking an order compelling the return of his wife and children." Though Abigail had been expecting this, the confirmation still sent a chill through her. "Has the judge agreed?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Martha's lips thinned in disapproval. "Not yet. Hammond is a reasonable man for all his adherence to the letter of the law. He's delaying his decision, asking for statements from witnesses to the incident." "Witnesses?" Abigail repeated, hope flickering faintly. "There were none. Only Eleanor and Josephine." "That's not entirely accurate," Martha said, setting down her cup with a decisive click. "I was returning from visiting my sister when I saw Walter Porter throw you into the yard that evening. I was too far away to intervene, but I saw enough to know the truth of the matter." Abigail stared at the older woman in astonishment. "You never said—" "I'm saying it now," Martha replied firmly, "to Judge Hammond and anyone else who needs to hear it. Walter Porter is a brute who cast out his wife and newborn child. That's the truth, and I'll swear to it before God and the court." Maxwell, who had been listening silently, leaned forward. "What else, Mrs. Wilson? You wouldn't ride all this way just to tell us what we already suspected." Martha's shrewd eyes assessed him with approval. "Direct as always, Mr. Reed. Very well. There's more." She turned to Abigail. "Your husband has been making certain claims about Mr. Reed's character and intentions. Unsavory claims that might influence how the community views this situation." Abigail felt heat rise in her cheeks, understanding immediately the nature of the insinuations. "That's absurd," she said hotly. "Mr. Reed has been nothing but respectful. He sleeps in the barn, for heaven's sake." "I'm well aware," Martha said dryly, "but Walter is desperate and growing more so. He needs to paint Mr. Reed as the villain in this piece to maintain his own standing." "Why?" Abigail asked, genuine confusion in her tone. "Walter was happy to be rid of us. He said as much. Martha and Maxwell exchanged a glance laden with meaning that Abigail couldn't quite decipher. "Mrs. Porter," Martha said carefully, "are you aware that your father left you certain property in his will, property currently under your husband's control, but which would revert to you in the event of separation?" Abigail blinked in surprise. "My father left me nothing but debts," she said. "The smithy was mortgaged to the bank. Walter paid off those debts when we married." "The smithy, yes," Martha agreed, "but not the land it stands on, nor the adjacent parcel that extends to the creek." She paused, letting the information sink in. "Land that has recently become considerably more valuable with the announcement of the railroad spur line." Understanding dawned slowly. "Walter wants me back because of the land. Walter wants control of the land," Maxwell corrected quietly. "Your return is merely the means to that end." The revelation should have hurt, Abigail supposed. Should have wounded her pride, at least, to know that her husband's sudden interest in reclaiming his family had nothing to do with affection or duty, and everything to do with financial gain. Instead, she felt oddly liberated. If Walter's motivation was purely mercenary, then perhaps this conflict could be resolved in purely practical terms. "Could I sell the land?" she asked, her mind racing ahead. "If it's truly mine—" "Not without Walter's consent as your husband," Martha said regretfully. "The law gives him control of your property during the marriage." "But if we were divorced?" Abigail began, voicing the thought that had been forming since her earlier conversation with Maxwell. "Then the property would indeed be yours to dispose of as you wish," Martha confirmed. "Assuming the divorce settlement doesn't award it to Walter, which would be unlikely given the circumstances of your separation." Maxwell had gone very still, his expression carefully neutral. "You're considering divorce, then?" Abigail met his gaze steadily. "I am," she said, the decision crystallizing even as she spoke the words. "If it's possible." Martha Wilson's eyes moved between them, sharp with assessment. "It won't be easy," she warned. "The courts favor husbands in such matters, and Walter will fight to maintain control of that land." "I understand," Abigail said, squaring her shoulders. "But I've lived in fear long enough. I won't return to Walter, not for any price. And I won't spend my life running, looking over my shoulder. I'll face this head-on." A rare smile curved Martha's thin lips. "Good," she said with evident satisfaction. "That's what I hope to hear." She reached into the pocket of her severe black dress and withdrew a folded document. "I took the liberty of consulting with Judge Hammond's clerk. These are the papers you'll need to file a petition for divorce, on grounds of cruelty and abandonment." Abigail accepted the document with hands that trembled slightly. "Thank you," she said, emotion thickening her voice, "for everything." "Don't thank me yet," Martha cautioned. "The battle has barely begun. Walter has friends in buckskin men who share his views on a wife's proper place. They won't take kindly to this challenge." "She won't face them alone," Maxwell said quietly, the simple statement carrying the weight of absolute commitment. Martha nodded, apparently satisfied. "I never doubted it, Mr. Reed." She rose, smoothing her skirts. "I should return to town. There's much to be done if we're to prepare for the legal proceedings ahead." As Maxwell helped the elderly woman back onto her horse, Abigail remained on the porch, the divorce petition heavy in her hands. A year ago, even a month ago, the idea of such a step would have seemed impossible, a remedy available to the wealthy or the desperate, but not to an ordinary woman like herself. Yet here it was, a pathway to freedom outlined in legal language on the pages she held. Not an easy path, certainly, but one that led toward a future she could shape, rather than merely endure. Martha Wilson departed with promises to return soon with more information. As the dust from her horse's hooves settled, Maxwell rejoined Abigail on the porch, his expression questioning but patient. "Are you certain about this?" he asked, nodding toward the papers in her hands. "Divorce is a difficult, socially, legally. There would be talk." "There's already talk," Abigail pointed out. "According to Mrs. Wilson, Walter has seen to that." She looked down at the document, then back up at Maxwell. "I'm certain. For the first time in years, I feel certain about something." Maxwell studied her face for a long moment, then nodded, accepting her decision without further question. "Then we'll proceed," he said simply. "Together." The word hung between them, laden with meanings neither was ready to fully articulate. Together. Not just for this legal battle, but perhaps for whatever came after. Abigail felt a weight lift from her shoulders, replaced by a cautious hope. She was choosing a difficult path, yes, but she was choosing it freely, with open eyes and a clear heart. Whatever came next, victory or defeat, vindication or condemnation, it would be the result of her own decisions, not Walter's actions or society's expectations. For a woman who had spent years conforming herself to others' demands, the realization was as intoxicating as it was terrifying. The following days passed in a flurry of activity. The divorce petition required documentation of Walter's cruelty and abandonment, which meant Abigail spent hours writing out a detailed account of her marriage. The task was painful, but oddly cathartic, like lancing a long, festering wound. Maxwell gave her space for this work, taking the girls on long walks to collect herbs, or teaching them simple tasks in the surgery to keep them occupied. In the evenings he read her accounts without comment, offering only occasional suggestions for clarity or additional details that might strengthen her case. His restraint, his refusal to express the anger she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes as he read her descriptions of Walter's treatment, was yet another kindness. He understood instinctively that what she needed was not outrage on her behalf, but steady support, as she found her own voice. On the third day after Martha Wilson's visit, as Abigail was completing the final pages of her statement, Maxwell entered the kitchen with an unusually serious expression. "Walter was in town again today," he said without preamble. "At the saloon, drinking heavily." Abigail set down her pen, her stomach tightening with familiar dread. Did he say anything about coming here?" Maxwell hesitated, then nodded. According to Tom Jenkins at the livery, he was boasting that he'd reclaim his property before the week was out. Jenkins thought he meant you and the girls. "But you think differently," Abigail said, reading the concern in his eyes. "I think he meant the land," Maxwell confirmed. "Your father's land. Now that Mrs. Wilson has revealed his true motivation, he may be desperate to secure his claim before you can file for divorce." Abigail felt cold despite the warmth of the kitchen. "You think he'll come here? Try to force me to return?" "It's possible," Maxwell acknowledged. "Walter is not a man known for subtlety or patience, especially when drinking." He met her gaze directly. "I think it would be wise for you and the girls to be prepared for that possibility." "Prepared how?" Abigail asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "I've made up a room in the barn," Maxwell said, "hidden with supplies. If Walter comes, you and the children can hide there while I deal with him." The thought of hiding, of cowering from Walter yet again rankled. "I'm tired of hiding," Abigail said more sharply than she had intended. "Tired of being afraid." "I understand," Maxwell said, his voice gentle but firm. "But Eleanor, Josephine, and Ruby shouldn't have to witness a confrontation with their father, not after everything they've already seen." The mention of her daughters punctured Abigail's brief flare of defiance. Maxwell was right, of course. Whatever her own feelings, her first duty was to protect her children from further trauma. "Show me this room," she said, rising from the table. The hiding place Maxwell had prepared was cleverly concealed behind hay bales in the barn's loft. A small space, but comfortable enough with blankets, water, and even a few books for the girls. Most importantly, it offered a clear view of the yard and house through a narrow gap in the boards while remaining invisible from below. "Eleanor is old enough to understand," Maxwell explained as they descended the loft ladder. "I've told her that if she hears me call out her father's name, she's to take her sisters up there immediately. You'll follow when you can." The thoroughness of his preparations both reassured and disturbed Abigail. "You've thought this through," she observed. "I prefer to be prepared," Maxwell said simply. "It may never be necessary." But they both knew it likely would be. Walter Porter was not a man to surrender what he considered his property without a fight. The only questions were when he would come, and what form his attempt to reclaim her would take. They didn't have long to wait for answers. That evening, as they sat on the porch enjoying the cool air after a warm day, the sound of approaching horses broke the peaceful twilight. Multiple horses moving fast. Maxwell rose in a fluid motion, his hand moving instinctively to his hip, where a revolver now hung in addition to his attire since Martha Wilson's visit. "4 riders," he reported, his voice calm but alert. "Coming from town." Abigail stood as well, her heart pounding. "Walter." "Most likely." Maxwell turned to her, his expression grave. "Get the girls. Up to the loft, now." For a moment, Abigail hesitated. The thought of hiding while Maxwell faced 4 men alone struck her as both cowardly and dangerous. "Abigail," Maxwell said, reading her reluctance, "please, for your daughter's sake, if not your own." The reminder of her responsibilities galvanized her. She hurried inside, calling for Eleanor as she went. The child appeared from the bedroom, her expression already anxious. "Is it Papa?" she asked, her voice small. "I think so, sweetheart," Abigail confirmed, gathering Ruby from her cradle. "Remember what Mr. Reed told you? Take Josephine to the special place in the barn. I'll be right behind you with Ruby." Eleanor nodded, her 6-year-old face suddenly seeming much older. She took Josephine's hand and led her toward the back door, whispering reassurances to her confused sister. Abigail followed Ruby, clutched to her chest, but at the door she paused, looking back toward the front of the house, where Maxwell now stood alone on the porch. The impulse to stand beside him was almost overwhelming. But Ruby's warm weight against her chest and the sight of her older daughters crossing the yard toward the barn decided her. Her place was with her children. Maxwell would have to face Walter alone. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. From the hiding place in the barn loft, Abigail had a clear view of the yard and the front of the house. She watched as 4 riders thundered up to the gate, dust billowing around them in the last light of day. Walter Porter sat astride the lead horse, his face flushed with drink, his hair wild beneath his hat. Behind him rode 3 men Abigail recognized from buckskin, not friends exactly, for Walter had few of those but drinking companions and fellow miners who shared his views on a woman's proper place. Maxwell stood on the porch, outwardly calm, though Abigail could see the tension in his shoulders. He had not drawn his revolver, had not even moved his hand closer to it. Instead, he stood with arms crossed, waiting for the riders to state their business. "Reed," Walter's voice carried clearly in the evening air, slurred but forceful. "Send out my wife and children. I've come to take them home where they belong." "Good evening, Porter," Maxwell replied, his voice steady and carrying. "I'm afraid Mrs. Porter isn't available to speak with you at present." Walter's face darkened. "She's my wife," he spat. "She'll speak to me when I say she will." He dismounted, swaying slightly as his boots hit the ground. "Get out of my way, Reed. I'm taking what's mine. Mrs. Porter and her daughters are not property to be taken," Maxwell said, his tone unchanged despite the growing tension. "They are people who have made their choices clear." One of Walter's companions laughed, the sound ugly in the gathering darkness. "Listen to him. The doc thinks women can make choices." Walter advanced toward the porch, his companions following a step behind. "Last chance, Reed. Step aside or we'll move you." Maxwell remained where he stood, a lone figure against four increasingly aggressive men. "You're drunk, Porter," he said calmly. "All of you are. Go back to town, sleep it off. We can discuss this matter when you're sober." "There's nothing to discuss," Walter snarled. "That's my wife in there. My children. My property." He took another step forward, hand moving to the knife at his belt. "And I'll gut any man who tries to keep them from me." In the loft, Abigail clutched Ruby tighter, her breath catching in her throat. Eleanor pressed against her side, trembling but silent. Even Josephine, too young to fully understand the danger, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, her usual chatter stilled. Maxwell still hadn't moved, hadn't reached for his weapon. "Is that truly why you're here, Porter?" he asked, his voice carrying a new note, not fear, but a kind of sad certainty. "For your family, or for the land your wife inherited, the land the railroad wants to buy?" Walter faltered, surprise flickering across his face, before it hardened again into anger. "Don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, but the denial lacked conviction. "I think you do," Maxwell pressed, taking a single step forward. "I think this sudden concern for your wife and daughters has nothing to do with affection and everything to do with the money that land will bring once the railroad spur is announced." Walter's companions exchanged glances, clearly unaware of this aspect of the situation. One of them, a heavy-set man named Dawson, frowned in confusion. "What land?" he asked, looking to Walter. "You said we were just fetching your woman." Walter ignored him, his gaze fixed on Maxwell with undisguised hatred. "You turned her against me," he accused. "Filled her head with ideas about rights and choices. Women don't have rights. They have duties. To their husbands, to their homes. And men have duties too," Maxwell replied evenly. "To protect, not harm. To cherish, not abuse." He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "You failed in those duties, Porter. You threw your wife and newborn child into the dirt. You abandoned them, not the other way around." In the loft, Abigail felt a surge of emotion at hearing Maxwell articulate so clearly what she had suffered, validating her experience in a way no one ever had before. Beside her, Eleanor's trembling eased slightly, the child drawing comfort from the steady defense. Walter's hand tightened on his knife. "You self-righteous bastard," he hissed. "Playing savior to another man's wife. Did you think I wouldn't find out about Boston, about what happened to your own family?" Maxwell went very still, the only sign that Walter's words had struck home. "My past is not at issue here," he said, his voice cooler than before. "Isn't it?" Walter pressed, sensing an advantage. "The great Dr. Reed, who couldn't save his own wife and children, who ran away to hide in the desert after failing them. And now you think you can save mine." In the loft. Abigail frowned, puzzled by this new information. Maxwell had told her Sarah and the twins died in a snowstorm, that he couldn't reach them in time. What was Walter suggesting? Whatever the truth, Maxwell refused to be baited. "This isn't about me," he said firmly. "It's about Abigail and her daughters. About their right to live without fear." Walter laughed, an ugly sound devoid of humor. "Rights again. Always rights with you." He turned to his companions. "What do you say, boys? Should we teach the good doctor about a husband's rights?" The men spread out, forming a loose semicircle around the porch. Maxwell still made no move toward his revolver, though his posture shifted subtly. Weight balanced on the balls of his feet like a boxer preparing for the first punch. "4 against 1, he observed mildly. "Hardly seems sporting." "This isn't sport," Walter growled. "This is justice. Buckskin justice for a man who steals another man's wife." "I stole nothing," Maxwell replied. "I offered shelter to a woman and children who had been cast out. Everything that followed was Abigail's choice, not mine." Walter's patience, never his strong suit, finally snapped. With a roar of rage, he lunged forward, knife slashing through the air toward Maxwell's chest. In the loft, Abigail bit back a scream, her hand flying to her mouth. Eleanor buried her face against her mother's side, unable to watch. Maxwell moved with a speed and precision that belied his usual deliberate manner. He sidestepped Walter's clumsy attack, caught the man's wrist, and used his own momentum to send him sprawling into the dirt of the yard. Walter's companions hesitated clearly, not having expected such efficient resistance. Maxwell stood on the porch steps, still making no move toward his revolver. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command. "Take him back to town before someone gets hurt." Walter scrambled to his feet, face contorted with rage and humiliation. "Get him!" he shouted to his friends. "What are you waiting for?" Dawson, the largest of the group, stepped forward reluctantly. "Look, Reed," he began. "We don't want trouble. Just give Porter his wife, and we'll be on our way." "Mrs. Porter is not mine to give," Maxwell replied evenly. "She's not property to be handed over. She's a person making her own choices." "Choices," Walter spat, retrieving his knife from where it had fallen. "A woman doesn't choose. She obeys." He turned to his companions. "Are you men or not? He's just one person. Get him out of the way." Perhaps it was the insult to their manhood, or perhaps simply the influence of the whiskey they had clearly consumed before riding out. Whatever the reason, the 3 men moved forward as one, closing in on Maxwell from different angles. In the loft, Abigail could remain silent no longer. "Maxwell," she called, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "Behind you." He turned just in time to dodge a blow from one of Walter's companions who had circled around to the side of the porch. The movement cost him his advantageous position, bringing him down into the yard, where the 4 men could surround him. Now, at last, Maxwell's hand moved to his revolver. But he didn't draw it, merely rested his palm on the grip in clear warning. "I don't want to use this," he said, his voice still calm despite the danger of his position. "Go home, all of you. This doesn't need to end in blood." Walter sneered, emboldened by numbers and drink. "You won't shoot," he said confidently. "The great healer taking a life? I don't think so." He gestured to his companions. "Take him." The men rushed forward as one. Maxwell drew his revolver in a smooth motion, but instead of firing, he brought the heavy grip down on the nearest attacker's temple. The man crumpled without a sound. The second reached Maxwell a moment later, swinging a wild punch that the doctor evaded with practiced ease. A short economical strike to the man's midsection doubled him over, gasping for breath. But the third Dawson was more formidable. He tackled Maxwell from the side, bearing him to the ground with his greater weight. The revolver went spinning from Maxwell's hand landing several feet away in the dust. In the loft, Abigail watched in horror as the two men grappled on the ground. Maxwell was fit and clearly experienced in physical confrontation, but Dawson had the advantages of size and weight. Worse, Walter was circling the struggling pair, knife still in hand, looking for an opening. Without conscious thought, Abigail passed Ruby to Eleanor. "Stay here," she ordered, already moving toward the ladder. "No matter what happens, stay hidden until it's safe." "Mama, no," Eleanor whispered frantically, but Abigail was already descending, driven by a fear deeper than any she had felt for herself. Maxwell was fighting might die because of her, because he had offered shelter when no one else would. She would not hide while that happened. The barn door stood slightly ajar. Through it, Abigail could see Maxwell finally gain the upper hand against Dawson, a well-placed strike, rendering the larger man momentarily stunned. But as Maxwell rose, Walter moved in from behind, knife raised for a killing blow. "Walter, stop!" Abigail cried, bursting from the barn. All movement in the yard ceased at her sudden appearance. Walter froze. Knife still upraised his expression, shifting from rage to calculating satisfaction. "Well," he drawled, lowering the knife slightly, "look who decided to join us. Come to watch your lover die, Abigail." Maxwell used the distraction to put distance between himself and the still dazed Dawson, moving to place himself between Abigail and the threats in the yard. "Go back inside," he said without looking at her, his attention fixed on Walter and the knife. "This isn't your fight." "It is," Abigail contradicted, stepping forward to stand beside him rather than behind. "It has always been my fight. I was just too afraid to face it before." Walter's gaze flicked between them, assessment replacing blind rage. "So it's true," he said, a nasty smile spreading across his face. "The rumors about you two, the respectable doctor and his whore." "Watch your language," Maxwell said, a dangerous edge entering his voice for the first time. Walter ignored the warning, his attention now fully on Abigail. "Did you think I wouldn't find out about the land, Abigail? About the railroad?" His voice dropped to a wheedling tone. "Come home. Bring the girls. We can start fresh. I'll even let you keep some of the money when we sell." The naked greed in his expression, the assumption that she could be bought like any other commodity, ignited something in Abigail that years of physical abuse had never quite managed to spark pure, righteous anger. "I'm not coming back, Walter," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Not for the land, not for money, not for anything. My daughters and I are done living in fear." Walter's face darkened. "They're my daughters, too," he snarled. "My property just like you. And I'll take what's mine one way or another." He lunged forward, knife slashing through the air. Maxwell moved to intercept him, but Dawson, recovering from his earlier stunning, grabbed at the doctor's legs, slowing him just enough that Walter's blade scored a line across his forearm. Maxwell grunted in pain but didn't falter, delivering a precise strike to Dawson's jaw that sent the larger man sprawling once more. Then he turned to face Walter Blood, now staining his sleeve crimson. "Enough, Porter," he said, his voice hard as desert stone. "You've had your chance to leave peacefully. Now you'll leave one way or another." Walter laughed, emboldened by the sight of blood. "Big words from a man who's bleeding," he taunted. "What happened to that famous control doctor? To do no harm, isn't that your oath?" "To do no harm," Maxwell agreed calmly, "but also to prevent harm where possible." His stance shifted subtly, becoming more aggressive. "And you, Walter Porter, are a source of harm to everyone around you." Walter's smile faltered at the cold certainty in Maxwell's voice. For the first time, he seemed to recognize that he faced not just a physician, but a man who had clearly known violence before, and was not afraid to engage in it when necessary. The moment of doubt was brief, overcome by whiskey and wounded pride. With a wordless cry of rage, Walter charged forward, knife held like a spear aimed at Maxwell's chest. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion to Abigail's frightened eyes. Maxwell sidestepped the charge with fluid grace, caught Walter's wrist as he had before, but this time used the man's momentum to slam him face first into one of the porch pillars with bone-jarring force. Walter crumpled to the ground, the knife falling from nerveless fingers. Blood poured from his nose, clearly broken by the impact. His companions, seeing their leader so decisively defeated, backed away, hands raised in surrender. "Take him and go," Maxwell ordered, retrieving his revolver from the dirt and training it on the remaining conscious men. "Don't come back." They obeyed with alacrity, dragging the semi-conscious Walter to his horse and draping him over the saddle like a sack of grain. Within minutes, they were riding away, dust billowing in their wake, as they retreated toward town. Only when they had disappeared from sight did Maxwell lower the revolver. He turned to Abigail, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, seemingly oblivious to the blood still seeping from the cut on his arm. Abigail nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The danger had passed so quickly, yet the memory of those moments when she thought Walter might kill Maxwell would haunt her for a long time to come. "The girls?" Maxwell asked, glancing toward the barn. "Safe," Abigail managed. "In the loft, as you planned." She reached for his injured arm. "You're bleeding." Maxwell glanced down as if noticing the wound for the first time. "It's superficial," he said dismissively. "Looks worse than it is." But Abigail would not be deterred. "It needs cleaning and bandaging," she insisted. "Come inside." In the kitchen, she set water to boil while Maxwell removed his shirt to better access the wound. The cut was indeed relatively shallow, but long-running from elbow to mid-forearm. As she cleaned the injury with careful hands, Abigail found herself studying Maxwell with new eyes. The lean strength of his torso marked with scars that spoke of previous encounters with violence. The controlled power she had witnessed in the yard so at odds with his usual gentle demeanor. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" she asked, applying the same salve he had used on Josephine's knee earlier in the day. Maxwell was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the kitchen window. "During the war," he said finally. "And after. Boston wasn't always a safe place for a doctor who treated all patients regardless of their ability to pay." Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story, but Abigail didn't press. There would be time for such questions later. For now, it was enough that they had survived Walter's attack, that her daughters were safe, that the man beside her had once again placed himself between her family and harm. As she finished bandaging his arm, Abigail found herself overwhelmed with gratitude, and something deeper, something she was no longer afraid to name, even to herself. "Thank you," she said softly, her hand lingering on his forearm. "For everything." Maxwell looked up, meeting her gaze directly. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of shared danger survived, of mutual respect, deepened by trial. "Always," he said simply. The word hung in the air between them, a promise more binding than any legal vow Abigail had ever made. Before either could say more, the sound of small feet on the porch announced Eleanor's arrival, Josephine and Ruby in tow. The moment passed, but its significance remained a foundation laid for whatever might come next in their shared journey. The buckskin courthouse had never seen such a crowd. Autumn sunlight slanted through dusty windows, casting long shadows across worn floorboards that creaked beneath the weight of the entire town. The air hung thick with tobacco smoke and the sharp scent of nervous anticipation. 3 weeks had passed since Walter's failed attempt to reclaim Abigail by force. 3 weeks of preparation, of statements gathered and documents filed, of whispers spreading through town like wildfire. Now the day of reckoning had arrived. Abigail sat ramrod straight on the hard wooden bench, her best dress smoothed carefully over her knees. Eleanor and Josephine flanked her, similarly dressed in their finest, with Ruby sleeping peacefully in a basket at her feet. Behind them sat Martha Wilson, a formidable presence in severe black, her silver hair gleaming in the dusty light. Maxwell occupied the bench beside them, his usual workday attire replaced by a formal suit that spoke of his Boston past. The cut was slightly outdated, the fabric showing signs of careful preservation rather than frequent use, but the effect was nonetheless impressive. He looked every inch the respected physician he had once been. Across the aisle, Walter slouched with feigned nonchalance. His nose remained swollen and slightly crooked from its impact with Maxwell's porch pillar, a visible reminder of his defeat. Beside him sat a young lawyer from Silver City, hastily retained when it became clear that Judge Hammond was taking Abigail's petition seriously. The rest of the courthouse was filled to capacity with the citizens of Buckskin, some drawn by genuine concern, others by the prospect of the most exciting spectacle the small town had witnessed in years. A woman suing for divorce from her husband, challenging the natural order of things. It was unprecedented in the territory. Judge Hammond entered through a side door, his black robes adding gravity to his already imposing presence. The room fell silent as he took his seat behind the bench, arranging his papers with deliberate care. "Court is now in session," he announced, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the room. "We are here to consider the petition of Abigail Porter for divorce from Walter Porter on grounds of cruelty and abandonment." He peered over his spectacles at the assembled crowd. "This is not a social gathering. Anyone who cannot maintain proper decorum will be removed from my courtroom. Is that understood?" A murmur of assent rippled through the room. Judge Hammond nodded, satisfied. "Very well. Mrs. Porter, please approach the bench." Abigail rose, her heart hammering against her ribs. Maxwell squeezed her hand and briefly, as she passed a silent gesture of support. She felt rather than saw Walter's glare following her progress to the front of the courtroom. "Mrs. Porter," the judge began, "you have filed a petition seeking dissolution of your marriage on serious grounds. Before we proceed, I must ask, are you fully aware of the consequences should your petition be granted? A divorced woman faces significant challenges in society." "I am aware, Your Honor," Abigail replied, her voice steadier than she had expected. "I consider those challenges preferable to remaining in a marriage that has become intolerable." Judge Hammond studied her face as if searching for signs of coercion or confusion. Finding neither, he nodded once. "Very well. Please be seated. We will hear testimony from both parties and any witnesses they may call." Walter's lawyer rose first, a thin man with ambitious eyes and a voice that carried the practiced cadence of formal education. "Your Honor," he began, "my client categorically denies the allegations made against him. Mrs. Porter was not abandoned, but rather left her husband's home, voluntarily taking his children without permission. Mr. Porter simply seeks the return of his family and the restoration of his natural authority as husband and father." The lawyer's gaze swept the courtroom, lingering on the more conservative elements of the community. This case represents not just one marriage, but an assault on the very foundation of society. If a wife may leave her husband's home without consequence, what becomes of the family, of order itself? Judge Hammond interrupted this rhetorical flourish with a raised hand. Mr. Collins, this court is concerned with facts, not philosophy. Your client will have the opportunity to present his case in due course. He turned to Abigail's side of the room. Mrs. Porter, do you have representation? Before Abigail could respond, Martha Wilson rose from her seat. Your Honor, Mrs. Porter has asked me to speak on her behalf, as she cannot afford legal counsel. A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. Women did not typically serve as advocates in legal proceedings, even informally. Judge Hammond's eyebrows rose, but after a moment's consideration he nodded. Mrs. Wilson is known to this court as a person of intelligence and integrity, he declared. While unusual, I see no reason to deny her request to speak for Mrs. Porter. He fixed Martha with a stern gaze. However, you will confine yourself to the facts of the case and relevant legal principles. This is not a platform for broader statements on the condition of women. Martha inclined her head in acknowledgement. Of course, Your Honor. We seek only justice under the existing law. What followed was a methodical presentation of evidence that belied Martha's lack of formal legal training. She called witnesses one by one, neighbors who had seen Walter's mistreatment of Abigail over the years, the midwife who had attended Ruby's birth, only to be called away and return to find mother and children cast out, even Sheriff Haynes, who reluctantly admitted that Walter's violent tendencies were well known to his office. Through it all, Abigail sat with quiet dignity, her gaze steady, even when the testimony touched on the most painful aspects of her marriage. Beside her, Maxwell remained a solid presence, his hand occasionally covering hers when a particular account seemed to affect her deeply. Finally, Martha called Maxwell to testify. He took the stand with the confidence of a man accustomed to being listened to, his voice carrying clearly as he recounted finding Abigail and her daughters on the night of their expulsion from Walter's home. Mrs. Porter was injured, exhausted from childbirth, and had nowhere to go, he stated. Her husband had thrown her out with no provisions, no shelter, no consideration for her condition or the welfare of their children. Walter's lawyer rose to cross-examine. Dr. Reed, he began the title, carrying a faintly mocking edge, you took a woman, not your wife, into your home, alone, without chaperone. Is that correct? I offered shelter to a mother and her children in desperate circumstances, Maxwell corrected. I myself slept in the barn to ensure there could be no question of impropriety. How gallant, the lawyer replied with a thin smile. And during this arrangement, did you develop feelings for Mrs. Porter? Feelings beyond those of a concerned neighbor? The question hung in the air like gun smoke. Abigail felt heat rise in her cheeks, aware of the many eyes now moving between her and Maxwell. Maxwell met the lawyer's gaze without flinching. My feelings are not relevant to these proceedings, he said evenly. What matters is that Walter Porter abandoned his wife and children in a vulnerable state, an action witnessed by multiple citizens of this town. The lawyer pressed on undeterred. Isn't it true that you have a history of inappropriate attachments to your patients, Dr. Reed, that such behavior forced you to leave your practice in Boston? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. This was new information, a hint at scandal in Maxwell's past that had not previously been known in Buckskin. Maxwell went very still, his expression carefully controlled. That is false, he said, his voice quiet, but carrying. I left Boston after the deaths of my wife and children. Any suggestion of professional impropriety is not only untrue but irrelevant to these proceedings. Is it, the lawyer challenged, or is this a pattern finding vulnerable women offering help with ulterior motives. He turned to face the judge. "Your Honor, we contend that Dr. Reed has manipulated Mrs. Porter, taking advantage of a temporary domestic disagreement to turn her against her lawful husband." Judge Hammond frowned. "Mr. Collins, unless you have evidence of such manipulation, I suggest you confine yourself to the facts of this case." The facts. Your Honor, are that Mrs. Porter was not abandoned. She left willingly with Dr. Reed, a man who had developed inappropriate feelings for her. Mr. Porter simply seeks to restore his family and protect his children from immoral influence. At this, Abigail could remain silent no longer. She rose from her seat, her voice clear despite her trembling hands. "That is a lie," she said firmly. "Walter threw us out. He said, and I quote, 'Don't come back until you've figured out how to give me a son, or don't come back at all.'" All eyes turned to her, the unexpected interruption creating a moment of stunned silence. Judge Hammond recovered first. "Mrs. Porter, while I understand your distress, you must allow the proceedings to continue in an orderly fashion." "With respect, Your Honor." Abigail replied, surprising herself with her own boldness. "The proceedings have become a platform for falsehoods about both my character and Dr. Reed's. I request the opportunity to speak the truth of my marriage." The judge studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, Mrs. Porter. Approach the bench. You will be sworn in and may then give your testimony." Walter half rose as if to object, but his lawyer placed a restraining hand on his arm. They had not anticipated Abigail speaking for herself, had counted on her traditional female reticence in public settings. After being sworn in, Abigail faced the crowded courtroom, her heart racing, but her resolve firm. For too long she had remained silent about her suffering. For too long Walter's version of events had gone unchallenged. No more. "My name is Abigail Porter." She began, her voice gathering strength with each word. "For 8 years I have been the wife of Walter Porter. During that time I have been struck, belittled, and treated as property rather than a person. I have watched my daughters learn to hide at the sound of their father's footsteps, have seen them flinch at sudden movements, have comforted them, after witnessing violence no child should ever see." The courtroom was utterly silent now, every face turned toward her, every ear straining to catch each word. "3 weeks ago, I gave birth to my third daughter, Ruby. Walter, who had made clear his disappointment at having daughters rather than sons, returned home drunk and enraged. He struck me while I was holding my newborn child. He kicked over our water bucket. He called us worthless burdens. And then he threw us out of the house, all of us, myself, still bleeding from childbirth, and 3 children, the youngest just hours old." Abigail paused, her gaze moving to Walter, who glared back with undisguised hatred. "Dr. Reed found us by the roadside," she continued. "He offered shelter without condition. He gave us safety when no one else would. He has treated me and my daughters with respect and kindness, asking nothing in return. If that is manipulation, then perhaps more men should practice it." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the courtroom. Several women nodded in agreement, though they quickly composed their features when their husbands glanced their way. "I do not seek divorce lightly," Abigail concluded. "I understand the difficulties I will face, but I cannot, will not return to a man who values me only for the sons I might bear, or the property I might bring him." She turned to Judge Hammond, her eyes meeting his directly. "Walter does not want me back because he loves me. He wants me back because my father left me land that the railroad seeks to purchase. Land that as my husband he controls. This is not about family. It is about greed." The final accusation hung in the air like summer lightning. Walter surged to his feet, his face mottled with rage. "She's lying!" he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Abigail. "This is Reed's doing. He's poisoned. Her mind turned her against me. Mr. Porter." Judge Hammond's gavel cracked against the bench. "You will control yourself in my courtroom or face contempt charges." Walter subsided, but his eyes burned with a promise of retribution that sent a familiar chill through Abigail's spine. "Your Honor," Martha Wilson called, rising from her seat, "there is another witness who should be heard, one whose perspective is uniquely relevant to these proceedings." Judge Hammond gestured for her to proceed. Martha turned to face the courtroom. "Eleanor Porter," she called, "would you please come forward?" A collective gasp rose from the assembled spectators. Calling a child to testify, especially in a matter concerning her parents, was almost unheard of. Even Maxwell looked startled, clearly not having anticipated this development. Eleanor rose from her seat, small and solemn in her best dress. She moved to the front of the courtroom with the careful dignity of a child trying very hard to appear grown up. Josephine watched her sister with wide, anxious eyes, unconsciously scooting closer to Maxwell. Judge Hammond leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "Young lady, do you understand what it means to tell the truth in court?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes, sir. It means to say what really happened, not what you wish happened or what someone wants you to say." "That's correct," the judge said, visibly impressed by her articulate response. "And do you understand that you're being asked to tell the truth about your parents? That can be very difficult for a child." "I understand, sir," Eleanor replied, her small hands clasped tightly before her. "But Mama always says that hard things must sometimes be done if they're right." A murmur of approval ran through the courtroom. Even Walter's lawyer looked uncomfortable, clearly reluctant to cross-examine a 6-year-old child. "Very well," Judge Hammond said. "Please tell us what you have seen in your home in your own words." Eleanor took a deep breath. "Papa gets angry a lot," she began, her voice small but clear in the hushed courtroom. "When he drinks the brown liquid, he gets even angrier. He hits Mama when dinner isn't ready, or when Josephine cries, or when he loses money at cards. He calls us useless girls. He says we're burdens." She paused, her brow furrowing in concentration as she carefully chose her next words. "When Ruby was born, Papa was very angry. He hit Mama when she was holding the baby. He pushed us all outside and locked the door. He said, 'Don't come back.'" Walter's lawyer rose. "Your Honor, with all due respect, children often misinterpret adult situations. I did not misinterpret," Eleanor interrupted, a flash of unexpected fire in her eyes. "I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Papa hurt Mama and threw us away like trash." The simplicity of the statement, delivered with a child's unflinching directness, landed with more impact than any adult testimony could have achieved. Several women in the courtroom dabbed at their eyes. Even some of the men shifted uncomfortably, unable to dismiss the clear recounting of events from such an innocent source. "And Dr. Reed," Judge Hammond prompted gently. "What can you tell us about him?" Eleanor's expression brightened. "Mr. Reed is kind. He teaches me about plants that heal and how to draw animals. He never shouts, even when I spill things. He tells stories about brave women, not just men. He makes Mama smile again." The final observation, offered with a child's guileless perception, brought a flush to Abigail's cheeks. She avoided looking at Maxwell, though she could feel his gaze upon her. "Thank you, Eleanor," the judge said. "You've been very brave and very clear. You may return to your seat now." As Eleanor walked back to her mother, her shoulders squared with pride at having done something difficult but important. A murmur of approval followed her progress. Whatever the legal outcome of the proceedings, it was clear that public opinion had shifted decisively in Abigail's favor. Judge Hammond called a brief recess to consider the testimony. As the spectators filed outside for air and conversation, Maxwell leaned close to Abigail. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, concern evident in his eyes. Abigail nodded, though in truth she felt drained by the emotional intensity of the proceedings. "I just want it to be over," she admitted, "one way or another." "It will be," Maxwell assured her. "You've done everything possible. The truth is on your side." Abigail glanced across the room to where Walter stood in heated conversation with his lawyer. "The truth isn't always enough," she murmured. "Not when it challenges what men like Walter believe they're entitled to." Before Maxwell could respond, Martha Wilson joined them, satisfaction evident in her usually stern features. "Well done, both of you," she said, "especially Eleanor. That child has more courage than most grown men in this town." "It was wrong to involve her," Maxwell said, a rare note of disapproval in his tone. "She's too young for such responsibility." "On the contrary," Martha replied firmly. "She's lived the truth of that household. Who better to speak it?" Her gaze softened as it fell on Eleanor, now showing Josephine a butterfly that had found its way through an open window. "Children see more than we credit them for, and they know justice when they encounter it." Before the conversation could continue, Judge Hammond returned to the bench, his expression grave. The room quickly refilled and settled into expectant silence. "I have considered the testimony presented today," he began. "This is not a simple case of domestic disagreement, as Mr. Porter's counsel has suggested. Rather, it involves serious allegations of cruelty, abandonment, and the welfare of 3 minor children." He shuffled the papers before him, then continued. "The law of this territory, while generally favoring the preservation of marriage, does provide for divorce in cases of extreme cruelty or abandonment. Based on the evidence presented, including the testimony of multiple witnesses and the child Eleanor Porter, I find that both conditions have been met in this case." A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. Walter half rose from his seat, his lawyer quickly pulling him back down. "Therefore," Judge Hammond declared, "I am granting Abigail Porter's petition for divorce on grounds of cruelty and abandonment." The pronouncement hung in the air for a moment before a buzz of conversation erupted. Judge Hammond silenced it with a sharp rap of his gavel. "As to the matters of property and custody," he continued, "the court rules as follows. Mrs. Porter shall retain full custody of her 3 daughters, with Mr. Porter granted visitation rights at Mrs. Porter's discretion, and only when sober." Walter surged to his feet, unable to contain himself. "You can't do this," he shouted. "They're my children, my property, Mr. Porter." The judge's voice cracked like a whip. "One more outburst, and you will be removed from this courtroom and held in contempt. Your children are not property. They are persons entitled to safety and care which the evidence clearly shows you have failed to provide." Walter subsided, his face dark with suppressed rage. "Regarding the land inherited by Mrs. Porter from her father," Judge Hammond continued, "the court finds that as this property came to her through inheritance rather than being acquired during the marriage, it shall revert to her sole ownership and control upon dissolution of the marriage." This pronouncement drew an even stronger reaction from Walter. "The land is mine," he protested, heedless of his lawyer's attempts to silence him. "I paid the debts I maintained it. You paid the debts on the smithy," the judge corrected, "which was indeed mortgaged. The land itself was never encumbered. The court's ruling stands." He fixed Walter with a stern gaze. Mr. Porter, I strongly advise you to accept this judgment with whatever grace you can muster. Further disruption will not be tolerated." With a final rap of his gavel, Judge Hammond declared, "This court is adjourned. The divorce is granted effective immediately." For Abigail, the moment seemed unreal, as if she were observing it from a great distance. Divorce. The word that had seemed impossible just weeks ago was now reality. She was no longer Walter Porter's wife, no longer his property. She was simply Abigail, free to make her own choices, to shape her own future. Around her, the courtroom erupted in activity, spectators discussing the unexpected outcome. Martha accepting congratulations from several women, Walter storming out with his lawyer, hurrying in his wake. Through it all, Maxwell remained beside her, a steady presence in the midst of chaos. When she finally turned to him, she found his eyes already on her, filled with a warmth that sent a flutter through her chest. "It's over," he said quietly. "You did it." Abigail shook her head. "We did it," she corrected. "I couldn't have faced this alone." Something shifted in Maxwell's expression, a softening around his eyes that made him suddenly appear younger, less burdened by the weight of his own past. "What happens now?" he asked, the question laden with meanings beyond its surface. Before Abigail could respond, Eleanor and Josephine surrounded them, the older girl bursting with excitement at having played a role in the proceedings, the younger simply happy that the tense atmosphere had lifted. "Are we free now, Mama?" Eleanor asked, her perception, as usual, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Abigail gathered her daughters close, including Ruby, who still slept peacefully in her basket, somehow undisturbed by the courtroom drama. "Yes," she said, the word tasting like honey on her tongue. "We're free." The ride back to Maxwell's ranch passed in a blur for Abigail. The autumn afternoon had turned golden, the desert landscape transformed by the slanting light into something almost magical, or perhaps it was simply that she saw it now through eyes no longer shadowed by fear. Eleanor and Josephine chattered excitedly in the back of the wagon, the significance of the day's events largely beyond their comprehension, but the general mood of victory perfectly clear to their sensitive perceptions. Maxwell drove in silence, his attention seemingly focused on the road ahead, though Abigail caught him glancing her way more than once, his expression thoughtful. She understood his reserve. Today's outcome, while a victory, also marked a crossroads. She was no longer in need of emergency shelter, no longer a married woman seeking temporary refuge. The unspoken question hung between them, what now? As the ranch came into view, its familiar outline silhouetted against the setting sun, Abigail felt a surge of emotion she couldn't immediately identify. It took her a moment to recognize it as homecoming, the profound relief of returning to a place where one belongs. Yet, this wasn't truly her home. It was Maxwell's, open to her in a time of need, but never intended as a permanent arrangement. "Mama, look!" Eleanor's excited voice broke into her thoughts. "The apple tree has new flowers." Abigail followed her daughter's pointing finger to the old tree that stood near the house. Sure enough, a few unseasonable blossoms had appeared among its branches, pale against the darkening sky. "How strange," she murmured. "Apples don't usually bloom in autumn." "Sarah used to say it was a special tree," Maxwell said, speaking for the first time since they'd left town. "That it bloomed when something important was about to happen." A faint smile touched his lips. "I always told her it was simply confused by the desert climate, but she preferred her explanation." "I like Mrs. Reed's explanation better, too," Eleanor declared with the certainty of childhood. "It's more interesting." Maxwell's smile deepened. "Sarah would have liked you, Eleanor," he said. "She had very little patience for dull explanations when magical ones were available." The casual mention of his late wife, offered without the usual shadow of grief, struck Abigail as significant. Perhaps the day's events had shifted something for Maxwell as well, had loosened the bonds of a past that had held him in its grip for too long. Once at the house, they fell into their familiar evening routine, Maxwell tending to the horses and outdoor chores, Abigail preparing a simple supper while the girls set the table. The normalcy of it was comforting after the emotional intensity of the courthouse. Yet beneath the surface of these domestic activities ran an undercurrent of anticipation, a sense that conversations delayed must now be had, decisions postponed, must now be made. After the meal, when the girls had been settled for the night, Abigail found Maxwell on the porch, staring out at the stars that had begun to appear in the deepening blue of the desert sky. "May I join you?" she asked, hesitating at the doorway. He turned, his expression warming at the sight of her. "Of course. It's your porch, too." The words, casually spoken, hung between them with unexpected weight. Your porch, too, as if this place were already hers in some way beyond temporary shelter. Abigail settled into the chair beside him, drawing her shawl closer against the evening chill. For a time they sat in companionable silence, watching as the stars multiplied above them, brilliant in the clear desert air. "What will you do now?" Maxwell asked, finally, his voice soft in the gathering darkness. The question Abigail had been both expecting and dreading. She turned it over in her mind, considering her options with the newfound clarity of a woman no longer bound by another's will. "I'm not entirely sure," she admitted. "The judge's ruling gives me control of my father's land, which provides some security. But I'll need to find work, a way to support the girls." Maxwell nodded, his profile limned with silver in the moonlight. "You have skills," he observed. "You read and write better than most in the territory. You've shown an aptitude for medicine. There would be opportunities in Silver City, perhaps, or even further west, if you preferred a fresh start." Each suggestion was presented neutrally, without pressure or preference indicated. As always, Maxwell offered possibilities without attempting to direct her choice. Abigail studied him, trying to discern his own wishes behind the careful presentation of options. "Is that what you think I should do? Leave Buckskin?" Maxwell was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I think," he said slowly, "that for the first time in your adult life, what you should do is entirely up to you. No one else's opinion should sway that decision, not Walter's, not the town's." He paused. "Not even mine." The absolute respect for her autonomy contained in those words touched Abigail deeply. Here was a man who understood what freedom meant to her, who would not seek to replace Walter's control with his own, however benevolent. "Nevertheless," she said quietly, "I value your opinion, not as a direction to follow, but as counsel to consider." Maxwell turned to face her, then his expression more open than she had yet seen it. "In that case," he said, "I hope you'll stay." The simple declaration, unadorned by qualification or explanation, sent a rush of warmth through Abigail's chest. "Here?" she asked, needing the clarity. "At the ranch." "Here," Maxwell confirmed, "at the ranch, in whatever capacity feels right to you." The careful phrasing did not escape Abigail's notice. "Whatever capacity feels right to you." He was offering possibilities without presumption, leaving space for her to define the terms of her own future. "And what would feel right to you, Maxwell?" she asked, emboldened by the day's victory and the intimate darkness that wrapped around them like a cloak. He drew a deep breath, as if gathering courage for a leap of faith. "I've grown accustomed to your presence," he began, then shook his head with a soft laugh. "No, that's not right. Accustomed suggests mere habit, and what I feel is More. He met her gaze directly. I've come to care for you, Abigail. For your daughters as well. The house feels more alive with all of you in it. I feel more alive. The admission, clearly difficult for a man unaccustomed to expressing such sentiments, moved Abigail deeply. I've come to care for you too, she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. More than I thought possible. Maxwell's expression softened further. Then stay, he said simply. Not as a guest, not out of necessity, but because you choose to. Because we choose each other. The offer hung in the air between them, shimmering with possibility. Abigail considered it carefully, not rushed by emotion, despite the quickening of her pulse. People would talk, she observed, though without real concern. A divorced woman living with a widower so soon after obtaining her freedom. People will talk regardless, Maxwell replied with a hint of amusement. They're doing so already, if today's proceedings are any indication. Abigail smiled, acknowledging the truth of this observation. Would we? She hesitated, then pressed on. Would we marry? Eventually, I mean. The question was bold, perhaps too bold for a woman only hours divorced, but Abigail was tired of indirection of words carefully chosen to avoid giving offense. She wanted clarity, honesty between them. Maxwell seemed to appreciate her directness. I hope so, he said. When you're ready, when enough time has passed that no one can claim your choices were made in haste or under duress. He reached across the space between their chairs, his hand covering hers where it rested on the arm. I'm in no hurry, Abigail. I've waited 8 years to feel this way again. I can wait as long as you need. The patience in his voice, the absolute lack of pressure or expectation confirmed what Abigail already knew. This man was unlike any she had encountered before. He understood that after years of Walter's control, what she needed most was the freedom to move at her own pace, to make decisions based on desire rather than necessity. Thank you, she said softly, turning her hand to lace her fingers through his. For understanding. For everything. They sat in companionable silence, after that hands joined watching, as the moon rose over the desert, casting the landscape in silver and shadow. No further declarations were made. No promises exchanged beyond the simple acknowledgement of mutual feeling and intention. For now, it was enough. The weeks that followed brought a gradual settling, a recalibration of life at the ranch to accommodate the new understanding between Abigail and Maxwell. Outwardly, little changed. Maxwell still slept in the barn, still maintained a careful respect for Abigail's privacy and autonomy. The girls continued their lessons. The garden was tended, meals prepared and shared. Yet beneath this surface of routine, currents of change ran strong and deep. Maxwell began teaching Abigail more advanced medical skills, treating her not as a casual student, but as a potential partner in his work. Abigail, for her part, transformed the domestic spaces of the house, adding small touches that made it truly a home. Curtains sewn from fabric purchased with her own money from the sale of eggs and extra garden produce, wildflowers arranged in jars on the table, a braided rug beside the hearth. Most significantly, Maxwell at last revealed the mystery of the locked room that had intrigued Abigail since her arrival. It proved to be a shrine of sorts, not the morbid collection of relics she had half feared, but a bright, airy space preserved exactly as it had been when Sarah and the twins died. A nursery with 2 small cradles, toys carefully arranged on shelves, books waiting to be read. I couldn't bear to dismantle it, Maxwell explained as they stood in the doorway. Couldn't bear to pack away their things as if they'd never existed. I understand, Abigail said softly, her heart aching for the loss so carefully preserved in this frozen moment of time. But is it healing to keep it this way? Maxwell considered the question with the thoughtfulness he brought to all matters. It was necessary, I think, for a time. He gazed around the room, his expression softening with memory. But perhaps that time has passed. The admission seemed to lift a weight from his shoulders, as if acknowledging that preservation of the past need not mean imprisonment within it. 2 days later, he asked Eleanor and Josephine to help him clear the room, explaining with gentle honesty that it had belonged to 2 little girls who had gone to heaven, and that now, perhaps, it could become a proper room for them and Ruby. The task became a kind of ceremony, each item carefully considered, some packed away to preserve the memory, others repurposed for the new inhabitants. Throughout the process, Maxwell spoke freely of Sarah and the twins, sharing stories that brought them to life in the girls' imaginations, not as ghosts to be feared, but as people to be remembered with love. Watching him with her daughters, Abigail felt the last of her reservations dissolve. This man who could transform grief into a lesson in love and continuity, who could honor his past without being chained to it, was someone she could trust with her future and the futures of her children. The town of Buckskin predictably bubbled with speculation about the nature of their arrangement. Some of the gossip was malicious, fueled by Walter's bitter accusations of impropriety. Some was more benign, a simple curiosity about whether the divorced Mrs. Porter and the widowed Dr. Reed would formalize their obvious attachment. Abigail found to her mild surprise that she cared very little about any of it. The opinions of others, which had once seemed so important, now paled beside the simple reality of the life she was building, a life of her own choosing, shaped by her own desires and values rather than external expectations. Walter remained a shadow at the periphery of this new existence. He had left town shortly after the divorce was granted, reportedly seeking his fortune in the silver mines to the north. But his absence brought only partial relief. Abigail knew all too well the tenacity of his grudges, the depth of his capacity for vengeance when thwarted. "He'll be back," she said to Maxwell one evening as they sat beneath the apple tree watching the girls chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "When the land sale to the railroad is finalized. When he realizes how much money he's lost." Maxwell nodded, accepting her assessment without attempting to dismiss her fears. "Perhaps," he agreed. "But he'll find you changed when he does, and not alone." The quiet certainty in his voice was more reassuring than any elaborate promises of protection could have been. Maxwell would not underestimate Walter, would not dismiss the threat he represented. But neither would he allow that threat to overshadow the life they were creating together. The railroad survey was completed in early November, confirming what local speculation had long suggested: the spur line would indeed cross the land Abigail had inherited from her father. The company's offer, delivered by a representative from Santa Fe, was more generous than she had dared hope, enough to provide security for herself and her daughters for many years to come if wisely invested. "What will you do with it?" Maxwell asked as they discussed the offer over coffee, the house quiet in the late evening hours after the girls were asleep. Abigail considered the question, turning the possibilities over in her mind, with the careful deliberation she had learned to apply to all major decisions. "Some will be set aside for the girls," she said, "for their education, for their futures." Maxwell nodded approvingly. "A wise provision. And the rest?" A smile curved Abigail's lips. "I thought, perhaps, a proper medical practice. Here at the ranch, but expanded, with modern equipment supplies." She met his gaze directly. "A partnership, if you're interested." The offer clearly surprised him. "A partnership," he repeated, turning the concept over as if examining an unfamiliar object. "You and I practicing medicine together." "Is the idea so strange?" Abigail asked, a hint of challenge in her tone. "You've said yourself, I have an aptitude for it, and the territory has few enough doctors without turning away those willing to learn the skills." Maxwell studied her face, something like wonder dawning in his expression. "Not strange," he said finally. "Unexpected, perhaps. Most women would use such a windfall for a fine house in town for social standing." "I'm not most women," Abigail reminded him, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "And I've had enough of town life and social standing to last a lifetime." Maxwell laughed, the sound rich and unguarded in a way it rarely was. "No, you certainly are not most women, Abigail Porter." He reached across the table to take her hand, his expression sobering into something more intense. "And yes, I would be honored to partner with you in this venture. In all ventures." The layers of meaning in that final statement hung between them, acknowledged, but not yet fully explored. There would be time for that, for the gradual deepening of their connection, for the careful building of a shared life. For now it was enough to know that the path lay open before them, shaped by mutual choice rather than necessity or convention. The railroad's offer was formally accepted the following week, the paperwork completed, with a thoroughness that left no room for future claims or disputes. Abigail signed the documents with a steady hand, Maxwell beside her as witness and support, but carefully not as agent or representative. This transaction was hers alone, the proceeds her own to dispose of as she saw fit. It was in its way as significant a moment as the granting of her divorce, another step toward full independence, toward a life defined by her own choices rather than a husband's authority. As November deepened toward winter, bringing cooler nights and occasional gentle rains to the desert, the rhythms of life at the ranch settled into a pattern that felt increasingly permanent. Maxwell began sleeping in the house again in a small room off the kitchen that had once been a pantry, still maintaining propriety while acknowledging the evolving nature of their relationship. Plans for the medical practice took shape, with Maxwell ordering equipment and supplies from as far away as Chicago, his excitement growing as each package arrived. Abigail continued her studies, devouring medical texts with the voracity of one who has discovered her true calling later in life and is determined to make up for lost time. The girls thrived in this atmosphere of purpose and positive change. Eleanor's drawings became more sophisticated, her natural talent nurtured by Maxwell's encouragement and the quality materials he provided. Josephine, once so shy and fearful, blossomed into a cheerful chatterbox, filling the house with songs and stories. Ruby grew sturdy and strong, beginning to crawl with a determination that kept everyone alert to potential hazards. It was, Abigail sometimes thought, with a sense of wonder, the life she would have chosen had she known such choices were possible. Not perfect, not without challenges, but fundamentally aligned with her own values and desires, rather than imposed by external forces. The last obstacle to complete happiness, Walter's lingering shadow, was addressed in early December when Sheriff Haynes rode out to the ranch with news that Walter Porter had been killed in a mining accident in Colorado. The news was delivered with the awkward sympathy reserved for deaths that, while tragic, could not be considered entirely unwelcome. "Thought you should hear it officially," Haynes explained, shifting uncomfortably in the saddle, "rather than through town gossip." Abigail thanked him for the consideration, her emotions more complex than she had anticipated. Relief, certainly. The persistent fear of Walter's return could at last be laid to rest. But also a strange, hollow sadness for the young man she had once believed Walter to be, before alcohol and resentment had twisted him into something unrecognizable. "Are you all right?" Maxwell asked later, finding her beneath the apple tree despite the December chill. Abigail nodded slowly. "I think so," she said. "It's strange. I feared him came to despise what he became. Yet once I thought I loved him, believed he loved me." Maxwell settled beside her on the bench, his presence warm and solid in the winter air. "Those feelings can be true simultaneously," he observed. The man you married and the man he became were in many ways different people. It's natural to mourn the former, while being relieved at the passing of the latter. The insight offered without judgment or expectation was exactly what Abigail needed. Maxwell understood as few others could the complexity of emotions that accompanied the death of someone who had once been central to one's life, for better or worse. "Thank you," she said, simply leaning against his shoulder in a rare gesture of physical closeness, "for understanding." Maxwell's arm came around her, tentative at first, then more secure as she settled against him. "Always," he promised the word, carrying the weight of absolute commitment. They sat in companionable silence as the December sun sank toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. The apple tree above them was bare now, its blossoms long since fallen, its fruit harvested for pies and preserves that would carry the taste of summer through the winter months ahead. Yet, in its bare branches, a promise remained of renewal, of growth, of life, continuing in its eternal cycle of loss and restoration. Like the tree, Abigail thought she had weathered seasons of dormancy and privation, only to discover an unexpected blooming on the other side. "I want to marry you," she said suddenly, the words emerging with a certainty that surprised even her. "Not because I need protection or security, not because it's expected, but because I choose it freely and with full awareness of what I'm choosing." Maxwell turned to her, his expression a mixture of surprise and joy. "Are you certain? It hasn't been very long since—" "I'm certain," Abigail interrupted gently. "I've had a lifetime of decisions made from fear or necessity. This one comes from a different place entirely." She met his gaze directly. "Unless you've changed your mind." "Never," Maxwell assured her, his voice rough with emotion. "I've wanted to ask, but I didn't want to rush you to make you feel pressured in any way." Abigail smiled, touched by his continued respect for her autonomy, even in this most personal of matters. "Always so careful of my freedom," she observed. "It's one of the many things I love about you." The word hung in the air between them, significant in its first utterance. Love. Not implied, not circumscribed with careful phrases, but stated plainly. Maxwell's eyes softened, the habitual reserve in his expression melting into something warmer, more vulnerable. "I love you too," he said simply. "More than I thought possible after Sarah. Differently, but no less completely." The honesty of the admission, acknowledging both his past and his present, without diminishing either, confirmed what Abigail already knew. This man would never ask her to be someone she was not, would never expect her to replace what he had lost. Their relationship would be built on truth, on mutual respect, on the recognition that each brought a complete self to this union. When, Maxwell asked, practical, even in this moment of emotion. Spring would be traditional, but Christmas, Abigail decided, if that's not too soon for arrangements to be made. I don't want anything elaborate, just us, the girls, perhaps, Martha Wilson, and a few others who have supported us. Maxwell nodded, clearly pleased by the suggestion. Christmas, he agreed. A new beginning at the turning of the year. The symbolism appealed to both of them, the idea of joining their lives as the days began their gradual lengthening as the promise of renewed light returned to the world. Under the apple tree, Abigail added, glancing up at the bare branches above them. Sarah's tree. It seems right, somehow. Maxwell's expression softened further at this inclusion of his first wife in their plans. This acknowledgement that she remained a part of him that would not, should not be erased or forgotten. She would have liked that, he said quietly. And she would have liked you, Abigail, very much. The simple statement, offered without artifice or sentimentality, brought tears to Abigail's eyes. "I wish I could have known her," she said, echoing words she had spoken once before. "In a way, you do," Maxwell replied thoughtfully. Through the garden, she planted the books she read, the home she created. He gestured toward the house, warm light spilling from its windows as the winter twilight deepened. "She's still here in the foundations of all this. And I think she would be pleased by what's growing from those foundations now." The thought brought comfort to them both. The idea that love need not be diminished by being shared across time, that the human heart has capacity for multiple attachments without betraying any. As darkness fell, they returned to the house hand in hand, to the warmth and light, to the girls waiting with their endless questions and observations, to the life they were building together, day by day, choice by choice. Above them, the apple tree stood silent, sentinel, its bare branches etched against the star-filled sky. In the deep quiet of its winter dormancy, unseen by human eyes, the first tiny buds of spring were already forming, holding within their tight-furled secrecy the promise of blossoms to come. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold. The desert landscape transformed by a rare dusting of snow that had fallen during the night. The mountains in the distance stood crisp against the sky, their upper reaches gleaming white in the early light. Inside the house, chaos reigned as preparations for the day's events reached their culmination. Eleanor and Josephine darted about in a state of barely contained excitement, their new dresses sewn by Abigail in secret evening hours, making them look older and somehow more solemn, despite their exuberance. Ruby, now nearly 4 months old, observed the proceedings from her basket with wide, curious eyes, occasionally contributing a gurgle of approval. Maxwell had risen before dawn, his innate calm showing signs of strain for the first time since Abigail had known him. He moved about his preparations with uncharacteristic distraction, checking and rechecking arrangements with an attention to detail that would have amused Abigail had she not been equally affected by the significance of the day. By mid-morning, the first guests began to arrive. Martha Wilson, in a wagon driven by her nephew, several families from the surrounding ranches, even Judge Hammond, whose presence conferred a kind of official blessing on the proceedings. Most surprising was the appearance of Tom Jenkins from the livery, and his wife representing that portion of Buckskin's population that had been won over by the events of the divorce trial. The ceremony itself was simple as Abigail had wished. No elaborate decorations beyond winter greenery gathered from the surrounding hills, no formal procession or complex rituals. Just two people surrounded by those they cared for, making promises neither took lightly. They gathered beneath the apple tree. Despite the December chill, the assembled guests wrapped in coats and shawls, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. Maxwell had cleared the snow from the ground around the tree's trunk, spreading a colorful blanket that Sarah had woven years ago, another inclusion of his past in their present that Abigail found deeply moving. Judge Hammond conducted the ceremony with dignified simplicity, his words focusing on partnership and mutual respect rather than the traditional emphasis on a wife's submission to her husband's authority. The progressive tone was clearly intentional, a nod to the circumstances that had brought Abigail and Maxwell to this moment. When it came time for their vows, Maxwell surprised Abigail by speaking from memory rather than repeating the judge's prompts, his voice steady and carrying in the winter stillness. "Abigail," he began, "I come to you not as a man seeking to possess or protect, but as a companion on life's journey. I promise to respect your choices, to support your growth, to stand beside you rather than before or behind you. To love your daughters as my own, to honor your past as part of what has shaped you, to face whatever comes with honesty and courage." He paused, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world seem to fade away. I promise to remember always that you are not mine to command or control, but your own person, who has chosen freely to join your life with mine. In this choice, I find joy beyond measure and gratitude beyond expression. Tears pricked at Abigail's eyes, not at the eloquence of the words, but at their perfect understanding of what she needed to hear, what would make this commitment different from her first marriage. Maxwell had seen her, truly seen her, and crafted vows that acknowledged her personhood rather than subsuming it. When her turn came, Abigail spoke simply, but from the heart. "Maxwell," she said, her voice clear, despite the emotion tightening her throat. "I come to you as a woman who has learned the value of choice, who no longer takes freedom for granted. I promise to build with you a home of peace and purpose, to raise our children, yours and mine, together, in an atmosphere of love and respect. To stand with you in times of joy and sorrow, to speak truth, even when it's difficult to listen, even when understanding is hard to find." She drew a deep breath, steadying herself for the final promise. "I choose you, Maxwell Reed, not out of necessity or fear, but out of love, freely given and gratefully received. In this choice, I find not the end of my journey toward selfhood, but its true beginning." A murmur of approval ran through the assembled guests. Even Judge Hammond, who had presided over countless weddings in his long career, seemed moved by the exchange of vows so clearly crafted to honor the specific journey that had brought this couple together. The rings they exchanged were simple bands of silver that Maxwell had fashioned himself at the forge, inscribed inside with a single word, choice. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona," Judge Hammond declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Equal partners in all things, as you have promised before these witnesses." The amendment to the traditional pronouncement drew smiles from the assembled guests, particularly Martha Wilson, whose approval was evident in the uncharacteristic softening of her stern features. Maxwell leaned forward to kiss Abigail, a brief but tender gesture that spoke of promise rather than possession. As they turned to face their guests, now officially husband and wife, Eleanor stepped forward with solemn purpose, a small package clutched in her hands. "This is for you," she announced, holding it out to Maxwell. "From all of us." Surprised, Maxwell accepted the package, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a drawing of extraordinary quality for a child of Eleanor's age. It depicted the apple tree in full bloom, with 5 figures beneath it: Maxwell, Abigail, Eleanor, Josephine, and Ruby. But there were 2 additional figures rendered in a softer, more ethereal style, a woman and 2 small girls watching over the scene with benevolent expressions. "It's our family," Eleanor explained earnestly. "All of us. Even Mrs. Reed and the twins. Mama said they're part of our family too, even though they're in heaven now." Maxwell stared at the drawing, momentarily speechless with emotion. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "This is the finest gift I've ever received." Eleanor beamed with pride, clearly delighted by his reaction. Josephine, not to be outdone, stepped forward with her own contribution, a small bouquet of winter berries and evergreen sprigs she had gathered with Martha Wilson's help. "For the table," she announced proudly, "to make it pretty for the wedding dinner." Abigail accepted the offering with appropriate solemnity, bending to kiss her middle daughter's forehead. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Thank you." The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. Tables had been set up in the barn, which had been swept clean and decorated with more winter greenery. A feast prepared by Abigail and several neighboring women covered the table's roast beef, freshly baked bread, preserved vegetables from the garden, and pies made from the apples that had been harvested in the fall. As the guests ate and talked, sharing stories and laughter in the warmth of the barn, Abigail found herself standing slightly apart, observing the scene with a sense of wonder. This gathering, this day, this new beginning, all of it had seemed impossible just months ago when she had knelt in the dust outside Walter's house, her newborn clutched to her chest, her future, a blank void of fear and uncertainty. Maxwell joined her, a plate of food in his hands that he offered with characteristic thoughtfulness. "You should eat," he said gently. "It's been a long morning." Abigail accepted the plate with a grateful smile. "I was just thinking," she said, "about how much has changed, how impossible this would have seemed to me that night you found us." Maxwell nodded, understanding as always. "Life changes quickly sometimes," he observed. "For better or worse?" "For better, in this case," Abigail said firmly. "Definitely for better." His expression softened, the habitual reserve that had marked his features when they first met, now largely absent. "I think so too," he agreed. He glanced around the barn, taking in the celebration unfolding around them. Sarah would have loved this. The house full of people, children running everywhere, music and food and laughter. The mention of his first wife, made without hesitation or apology, on this of all days, confirmed again what Abigail already knew. Their marriage would be built on honesty, on the acknowledgement of all that had shaped them, good and bad, joy and sorrow. "Tell me about her," she invited, genuinely interested, rather than threatened by the woman who had come before her. "What was she like on your wedding day?" Maxwell's eyes took on the distant look they sometimes did when he spoke of Sarah, not with pain now, but with fond remembrance. "Radiant," he said, laughing. "She wore flowers in her hair, white blossoms from her mother's garden. Her father disapproved of the match, thought a doctor wasn't grand enough for his daughter, but she didn't care. She said—" He paused, a smile touching his lips at the memory. "She said she'd rather have purpose than position, rather make a difference than make an impression." "I think I would have liked her very much," Abigail said softly. "You would have," Maxwell agreed, "and she would have approved of this of us." Sarah believed in second chances, in life's capacity for renewal, even after the deepest losses. From across the barn, Eleanor called out to them, eager to show off a trick one of the neighbor's children had taught her. The moment of quiet reflection ended naturally, both of them drawn back into the celebration by the needs and joys of the present. The day passed in a blur of food and conversation, music provided by Maxwell on his harmonica, and Tom Jenkins on a fiddle produced from his wagon. Children played in the yard despite the cold, their laughter carrying on the winter air. Women exchanged recipes and household advice. Men discussed the prospects for spring planting and the likely impact of the railroad's arrival. It was in many ways an ordinary gathering of neighbors, the kind of social occasion that formed the backbone of community life in the isolated settlements of the territory. Yet for Abigail, it held extraordinary significance, not just as her wedding day, but as a tangible representation of her new place in the world. Here, she was not Walter Porter's troublesome wife, or Maxwell Reed's charity case, but a woman in her own right, respected for her choices and her character. The sidelong glances and whispered judgments she had feared after the divorce had largely failed to materialize, replaced instead by a general acknowledgement that she had done what was necessary for herself and her children. As the short winter day drew to a close, the guests began to depart, offering congratulations and good wishes as they bundled into wagons and mounted horses for the journey home. Judge Hammond was among the last to leave, pausing to speak privately with Maxwell and Abigail before his departure. "I've presided over hundreds of weddings in my time," he said, his usually stern features softened by the occasion. "Few have given me as much satisfaction as this one. You've both overcome significant obstacles to reach this day, and I believe you'll build something worthwhile together." Coming from the judge, whose reputation for austere practicality was well established, the words constituted high praise indeed. "Thank you for everything, Your Honor," Abigail said sincerely, "for your fairness during the divorce proceedings and for conducting our wedding today." Judge Hammond nodded, accepting the thanks with dignified grace. "The law exists to serve justice, Mrs. Reed, not merely to preserve tradition. It pleases me when I can apply it in a way that achieves both." With that, he too departed, leaving Abigail and Maxwell alone with the children and the pleasant disarray of the celebration's aftermath. The girls, exhausted by the day's excitement, were easily persuaded to retire early. Even Ruby, usually fussy in the evenings, settled quickly, as if sensing the special nature of the day and cooperating accordingly. Abigail joined Maxwell on the porch afterward, both of them wrapped in blankets against the December cold. The night was clear, stars blazing with the extraordinary brilliance particular to desert winters, their light reflecting off the thin layer of snow to create a landscape of silver and shadow. "Happy?" Maxwell asked, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting comfortably against him. "More than I knew was possible," Abigail replied honestly. "And you, the same," he said simply. "Though I'll be happier still when the medical supplies arrive from Chicago and we can begin setting up the practice properly." Abigail laughed, the sound bright in the winter stillness. "Always thinking ahead," she teased gently. "Can't you simply enjoy this moment?" Maxwell's expression turned thoughtful. "I spent so many years looking backward," he said after a moment, "trapped in memories, in regrets for what I couldn't change. Looking forward feels liberating." The observation struck Abigail as profound in its simplicity. Maxwell had found his way out of the past, just as she had found her way out of fear. Together, they had created something neither could have anticipated: a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and love freely chosen. "What do you see when you look forward?" she asked, genuinely curious about his vision for their shared future. Maxwell considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "The practice growing," he said. "Perhaps training others, especially women, who might not otherwise have the opportunity to learn medicine. The girls growing up strong and educated, making their own choices about their lives." He paused, then added more softly, "And us growing old together, watching the seasons change, seeing the work of our hands bear fruit." The image he painted was not one of grand achievements or dramatic gestures, but of a life built day by day, choice by choice, purpose by purpose. It was, Abigail thought, exactly the future she would have chosen had she known such choices were possible. "I see the same," she said, nestling closer against his side. "And I can't think of anything I want more." They fell into comfortable silence after that, content to be together in the quiet of the winter night, beneath stars that had witnessed countless human stories of loss and renewal, endings and beginnings, despair and hope. Inside the house, their daughters slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge of being loved and valued. Around them, the ranch slumbered beneath its thin blanket of snow, the garden dormant but alive beneath the frozen ground, the old apple tree standing sentinel against the star-filled sky. And in that tree, unseen in the darkness, the first tiny buds of spring waited patiently for their moment to unfold, a promise of renewal as old as time and as fresh as tomorrow's dawn.